I think we are live. Good morning, everyone. Again, for those of you who don't know, the man above me, or it depends where he's on your screen, is Rob Halliday, who is a fantastic, well, we're going to get his whole story in a minute, so I won't steal his thunder, but very accomplished now designer and associate and a programmer, and writes for lots of magazines like, oh God, I forgot the name of all the magazines, Rob.
LSI, Mighty Sound International.
That's it, yeah. LSI. So you can read him in all those magazines, which I'm sure you have, because you should be getting all those magazines. But welcome, Rob, and thank you for talking to us this morning.
Hello, everybody. I can't see. So it's like being in a theatre with nobody there.
Yeah, you just talk to yourself. It's fine. I do that when no one's online anyway. So, Rob, tell us, how on earth did you get involved in all this crazy lighting stuff?
Well, I don't admit this very often, but I started off doing sound, but we don't say that out loud. But that was only at school.
We'll bleep that out.
And sound came from music, and so basically I went to a school that didn't do drama. It was a very serious school, but there was a sort of one of those inspired teachers who after school did extracurricular drama. And he was the classics teacher, so he'd always do like crazy rock and roll versions of Greek classics, which is slightly insane. And the tradition in the school was that there was a sort of progression through the school of the technical people. So you'd start off being the helper, and by the time you got to the end of school, you were being the designer. And there was a teacher strike where our school teachers didn't go on strike, but they refused to do any extracurricular stuff. So that sort of chain of succession was broken over about 2 or 3 years. So by the time I got into it, all the people who knew what they were doing had all left. And then there were a bunch of people who sort of thought it might be interesting. And it's interesting because the first thing I learned was to sort of hold your ground. Because on the first show where I did the sound, this kid ran on stage with a microphone to do the big rap number in the middle of this Greek drama. And no sound came out. And the director teacher, who was brilliant but had a bit of a temper, came and yelled at me, and I just yelled back that if the kid was going to turn the microphone off, then there really wasn't anything we could do about it, and maybe he should go talk to the kid on stage. And somehow that forged a bond with this teacher, because I think he was used to pupils just going yes sir, yes sir. So that was quite an interesting thing. Hold your ground.
You've been difficult from day one, is what
well, yeah, And on that show, they'd brought in a grown-up who'd left to come back and do the lighting, and just watching him work, somehow that was more interesting to me than sound. I don't know why, it just was. So I went to the library and I found all the books you could find about lightings, which is by this elderly, apparently, gentleman called Rich Pilbrow and this other guy called Francis Reed, and all the textbooks that we now know, and sort of devoured all of them. Did another show for the school where I lit it, which, in retrospect, I can look at the photos and go, well, that looks terrible. But there are 1 or 2 moments where you can look at the photos and see there was an idea there, at least, which I think is the important thing. Then I've discovered in the newspaper one day this thing called the National Youth Theatre, which is where if you're a kid aged sort of about 14 to sort of about 20, you get to go do theatre during a summer holiday. And I applied to it, and I went for an interview with my one lighting plan that I'd done at this point, and I was summarily rejected. And sort of unlike me, but I was so into the idea that I applied again the next year and got in. And what I discovered in the years that I went back and ran the youth theatre was that was sort of their first level filter. Because, if you imagine there were 20 people doing lighting and they could only take in 5 new people each year, and they got, 200 applicants. If you applied again the second year, that was quite a good indication to start with that you were keen and actually wanted to be there. So, got in, did that 3 years. Amazing learning curve, because this wasn't then the youth theatre doing theatre in little fringy theatres. It was, my first show was in a big cathedral in Edinburgh as part of the official Edinburgh Festival.
Wow.
It was doing shows at the Playhouse, which is a big West End theatre in London. With an amazing group of people. So the second year I was there, there were 2 staff electricians, and the assistant electrician was some whippersnapper, up-and-coming rock and roll chick called Paulie Constable, and
heard of it, yeah.
You've heard of her now. And we sort of got on because she was a bit scared of me apparently, and I was a bit scared of her, and we sort of bonded through that, I think. So I've known Paulie forever.
Wow.
The guy who was the light designer for those shows, I got on with really well, and he was then the person who gave me my first job when I came out of college, which was touring around the world for 2 years with this touring lot called the English Shakespeare Company. So I didn't. Sorry to break this to people who are out there. I didn't go to drama school. The youth theatre was very much sort of learning as you do it, training rather than being trained training. I went to university for 3 years because my parents are, university people who insisted I had to have a real education. So I, again, don't admit this very loudly, but I did a 3-year computer degree that I did really badly in, because I spent 3 years in the college theatre lighting shows, figuring out how to do just enough work to sort of get by. And then I went touring for 2 years, and I think that's an invaluable learning experience, is turning up in a different theatre around Britain every single week, because you have about 4 minutes to make friends with everybody, or certainly to not piss them off. Otherwise, they're just going to make your week, absolute hell.
It's the best.
But also, you very quickly learn about every single style of theatre going and every single style of crew. You learn about, your country, because lots of people, once they get sucked into London, never really go out of London. This wasn't just like one show touring, it was 2 shows in rep, so we sort of never stopped. So you were always learning about focusing and getting the show back to looking the same. We toured a rig, so you were learning about that, but we didn't tour front of house, so you were having to adapt what you did every week. It was an interesting time. So this was the early 90s, so we toured a lighting desk for our on-stage rig, but then had to use their control for front of house, because there wasn't very often a way of interfacing our new trendy DMX lighting desk into some old decrepit theatre. So now you're literally, and this sounds ridiculous now, but you're going in with a printout and having people type all the numbers in again, which I don't think anybody would do now. But those tours also took me to America for the first time. They took me to Japan for the first time. They took me to Korea for the first time, around Europe, and that's, I don't think you could get a better education in theatre.
What an amazing learning experience that must have been.
And particularly because the person I was working for had already been touring around Britain and the world for sort of 5 or 6 years at that point, and knew the ropes, knew the routine, knew the crews, got on really well with people. I saw a question from somebody earlier saying, when you're touring, how do you know how much cable you need to take to plug in? Kevin used to have a little secret notebook, which is where you plug in the mains in every theatre in the country, so that, when he did a tour schedule, he'd figure out the worst case and then order enough cable to do that. But also, the main thing I learned from him was, if you got to tea break time, it didn't matter if you only had 30 seconds to focus the next light. He would say, right, let's stop and have a cup of tea. Because the danger is, if you don't do that, you just sort of get caught in the next job and caught in the next job, and then half an hour's gone and everybody's pissed off with you because they feel that they should have had a little rest. And it's skills like that I think you don't get.
Just getting a bit of fresh air in the day as well, right, is so important.
Yeah. So I did that for 2 years. I went in the summers. I went back to the youth theatre alarmingly, I realise, as the 22-year-old grown up in charge of a bunch of 18-year-olds. In retrospect, it's crazy. And then I had a happy accident, which is I got a phone call from somebody I knew at White Light, who are a rental company in London, who I've grown up with, saying, what are you doing this afternoon? Can you go to a regional theatre outside London and help out on a show just for the afternoon, because the guy running the lighting desks hurt their leg and had to go to hospital, because he was also rigging and hanging lights. And I was really meant to be doing something else with a friend of mine, but you always go, what's the show? And they said, oh, it's this production of Piaf, directed by Peter Hall, very big name director then, now sadly passed away, being lit by David Hersey. And David at that point, still is to some extent, but at that point was the name in lighting. Original Cats, Les Mis, Starlight Express, Miss Saigon, that whole run of shows, 20 years at the National Theatre. So at that point you sort of go, let me rearrange my afternoon. And I went. It was a production of Piaf starring Elaine Page. I don't know what had been going on. I don't quite know why David was lighting it, because it was, a Bill Kenwright tour, which for those who know it in the UK is sort of cheap and cheerful touring. But it was when Bill Kenwright was trying to add a bit of class to the top end of his productions, I think. And I sort of
plays, didn't he?
Yeah, and I sort of came in and sat down behind the lighting desk, and this isn't moving lights or anything. It's just some lights and some scrollers and an old Harry ETC desk. And, you know, the short version is I'm still working for David. He's sort of retired now, but 30 something, 28 years later. And that wasn't necessarily from being anything brilliant. It was just from knowing when to ask questions, knowing when to shut up, and knowing how to press the right buttons in roughly the right order. You know, because I then ended up, it turned out they hadn't booked a production electrician for the tour, which is, or they had, but he didn't want to do it for Ken Wright money. So I ended up being the production electrician. And then I didn't hear from David for like 9 months after that. And then I got a phone call from some person claiming to be a production manager for Cameron Macintosh, saying David Hersey's lighting the new production of Oliver at London Palladium. He's asked for you to come and be the moving light programmer. Are you available? And you go, let me think. Yes.
Yeah. All right.
And you know, and as a result of that, I did all of Cameron's shows for the next until about 2011, I think. So that's the next 18 years or so. So, you know, but the flashback moment is if you go, if I hadn't answered my big clunky 1990s mobile phone that day, or if the battery had run flat, or if whatever, and if they'd gone on to the next person on their sort of dialing list, would it all have been different? You know, and I think part of the thing to remember about that is you should think very hard before you say no to anything, not just because of that job, because you don't know what that will then lead to and lead to and lead to and lead to. You know, and even if this particular job feels like a terrible thing that's, you know, underpaid, I'm not saying you should do it for free, but we all make choices about, you know, to do the job for less money than we should because it's interesting. But, you know, you should think really hard before you say no, particularly when you're getting going. I mean, there's sort of only been 2 things I've ever really actually definitively said no to in my life. And the rest of the time, if somebody called and said, can you come and do this? My tendency is to say, yeah, sure, of course I can. And then go figure out how to do it. So.
That is good advice. That's great advice. And that's how you became Big Bad Programmer.
Well, I mean, it feels like a terrible joke now because at that point, you know, I dealt with little bits of moving lights on little tiny shows because we borrowed them for the youth theatre and things. But I mean, didn't really have a clue what I was doing. But it was timing because what was happening then was it was just when the Verilights were becoming unshackled from having to be run on the Verilight desk, the artisan. It's just when other people were starting to make moving lights that could run from DMX desks. It was just when people were starting to make DMX desks. So you know, the amazing thing to me on that show was they said, right, you're the programmer, you go choose what you want to use. And, you know, having grown up in rep where you show up and sort of use whatever's there, you're like, what? Okay. And I think the show was in the autumn, which meant we got to go to Plaza. But with, you know, the bit where it says, you know, what is your spending power? And you always just lie and tick the £1 million plus box.
Oh, yeah. 5 million, sure.
You could sort of tick that for real and have a thing that said Cameron Macintosh Limited on your badge and actually sort of be doing real shopping. You know, so that was the year the Whole Hog 2 sort of came out, but wasn't really usable then. It was the year the Strand, what became the Strand 500, just came out in the sense that the case was there, but it didn't actually do anything yet. So I fell back on what I knew, which is we used the ARRI Imagine, which in America I think is the ET Express or Expression Desk with the macro tablet they used to make, and sort of created a way of doing it around that, which again, looking back now, you go, well, that was terrible. But the important thing was it let us do the job. You know, it let us control a rig of, again, it sounds so tiny now, but like 12 VL5s and 12 VL6s or something. VL6s were brand new. I think we were the first people to use them. And that was just the moving lights and the scrollers. And then somebody else with a big Galaxy desk that the Palladium had ran the rest of the rig. You know, so I was only concentrating on my little tiny bit. You know, and again, wasn't, as Sarah touched on this yesterday, it wasn't necessarily about being the quickest or the fastest. As long as you could do it and do it to satisfaction, but also just get on with the lighting designer and know what they were trying to do and sort of figure out the look they were going for and figure out the language they were using to describe it. Because I think I've said this, some of the people have heard me say this before, but the role of the programmer is sort of it's like an interpreter or a translator. You know, you're the person that sits between this vision the designer has in their head and all this sort of mechanics and computers and motors and stuff. And where the analogy goes a step further is if you are, you know, when you start speaking French, what you tend to do is to listen to the English and then process it word by word and then spit out the French equivalent word by word very slowly.
Right.
And then all the French people look at you like you're crazy because that's not actually how you say things in French. What eventually happens with a language is you become fluent, which means you stop thinking about it in English first and you just say it in French or whatever. And I think what happens with a lighting desk when you sort of bond with it, and then with a lighting designer when you bond with them, is you get to the point where you become fluent in David Hersey or Howard Harrison or Neil Austin or whoever. And that's the thing Dan was talking about yesterday about being one step ahead of them. That's because you're already thinking on their wavelength. And I think that's also why once you get that bond formed, which is really hard, like the first time you do a show with a new designer, because everyone's sort of on tenterhooks and being very polite and not quite knowing what their boundaries are and what they're allowed to do. But once you establish all of that and you learn what David Hersey means by blue or what David Hersey means by backlight versus what Neil or Howard or anybody else means by blue or backlight, because they'll be different things, the process becomes much quicker and they will ask you to come and do it again. So they don't have to go through all that sort of training, climatization process again.
Speak the same language now.
Yeah, I mean, and the best of lighting designers will always surprise you. You can't always be ahead of them, because what makes the best of lighting designers brilliant is that when you think you've sort of figured out all their ticks or tricks or whatever, they'll just say, can you just turn on some completely unexpected light and something amazing will fall out.
Yeah.
And that's the bit I love sitting next to them, because it's like you're the co-pilot, but ultimately they're the one in charge, Yeah. And the other thing I started saying more recently is there's quite a high danger that as the programmer, you start to think you're the hardest working person in the room, because you're like, and the light designer's drinking coffee and reading the newspaper and gossiping with the director. But at the end of the day, when all the yelling and shouting and screaming starts, it's all going to be directed at them, and you can just sort of hunker down out the way and quietly get on with your job.
Yeah.
So the last part of all of this thing is you can never think you're the sort of most important or hardest working person in the room, because at the end of the day, you're a conduit for their idea to get to this stuff on stage. And you just have to do that as well and as fast as you can by knowing as much as you can about all the stuff you're using. Anyway, that's how I got going.
Well, and then that you being the conduit for the designer is probably what naturally led to this development of the very unique role in the UK of the Programmer Associate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's actually two steps to that. I think, because the first part is when we all started, and by we I mean before me, there was in the Verilight world when you had to use, everyone forgets this now, but when the Verilights first came out, you had to be a super secret sort of approved Verilight person to get anywhere near any of it, to use the console, to use the lights. If you rented a Verilight system, you used to have a little team of people and a secret tent, and when anything broke, it would go into the secret tent and the secret Oompa Loompas would fix it, and then it would come back and it would carry on. And that was kind of an amazing double trick on Verilight's part, because on the one hand, it meant they were trying to protect their intellectual property and the design of the lights, because nobody else could sneak a look at it.
Yeah.
But it also meant, as a producer, it didn't matter to you how unreliable the lights were, because as part of the money you were paying, there was a team of people there to just fix it. So they would come in and swap the light and put another one up, and you didn't have to worry about it. And then it would get fixed and come back later on. Where that didn't translate very well was when you started going to the model of putting lights into long-running theatre shows. That works really well for rock and roll. It doesn't work so well when you put them into Miss Saigon, the original Miss Saigon, for example. So they had to start changing the model and letting people in a little bit. But at that time there were maybe, I don't know, 10 Verilight programmers in the whole wide world. And some of them, they all sort of came from rock and roll. Some of them sort of moved into theatre, but theatre is a completely different dynamic from rock and roll. And some of them didn't get on with it, but a very few did. So, this one hand is Oz Owen, who did all the big Pink Floyd tours, for example. There's Richard Knight, who did the original Miss Saigon and a lot of those very early shows. In America, there's Alan Henderson, who's still around doing Lion Kings, but was one of that sort of first generation of theatre programmers. Andy Voller was in there quite early before me. And I'm the sort of, there's a next wave, which is people like me and Stuart Porter actually started on the Verilight desk. but there's a next wave who sort of never really used the artisan and started doing these other desks when these other lights came along. So we changed the job title slightly because we stopped being the Verilight programmer and we became the moving light programmer. But we're still only dealing with this little subset of the rig. And that's sort of forced on us by the technology. And it's sort of forced on us because that's the way the light designers have got used to working. You know, there's the conventional lights and there's the moving lights. And they think of them as two completely different things. You know, now, as soon as you start doing that, or I started doing that, it just felt like this was ridiculous, you know, because on a practical level, if the light designer says, right, channel 1 at 50, there are two people now sitting there going, do you mean my channel 1 or his channel 1? Which channel 1 are we talking about? Yeah. So, you know, a legacy of that is on the MA consoles. There's still a thing called fixture and a thing called channel because they're trying to give you a separate word to use to describe which light to use. You know, okay, record Q1. All right, I'm going to make that 5 seconds. Okay, so we both make it 5 seconds. And then, you know, something like I'm distracted or the other guy goes to the toilet and the light designer carries on working. He says, right, make Q1 6 seconds. Well, now the two desks are out of sync because one guy's heard the instruction, one person has heard the instruction and the other one hasn't. So now you have a load of management at the end of sort of checking everybody's in sync all the time. And this, you know, it felt silly to me. You know, maybe not still on a huge show where there's a huge rig and what you're actually doing is dividing up the workload, but this completely artificial split just felt wrong. So later on, Martingale, which is about 96, and then the other thing that felt silly about it was that then for the entire run of the show, you ended up with these two completely separate lighting desks sitting there with their backups, and either somebody having to do this with 2 fingers, which everyone objected to, or with some kind of clever MIDI triggery something to link them together. So 96 on Martingale, we made the show on 2 desks, but then we did quite a convoluted process to combine them into 1 desk. So that was all we left in the theatre and a backup. And then we did, and here also remember that the moving lights are the underdogs. You know, so Oliver, you know, there's 500 lights in the rig and there's 24 moving lights. By the time we got to, I think, a tour of Oliver, which I think was about 1998, like the moving lights were taking over because for the reasons you were talking about earlier, on touring, it's much easier to put up a rig of moving lights and then deal with them. Because even if, you know, ideally you'll put the truss up in the same place and everything will go back to the same place and job done. But even if you have to move the lights a bit, it's much easier to type a number and wiggle a trackball thing than to have somebody climb a ladder or a telescope or a genie lift or whatever. Yeah. And you can do it while other stuff is happening on the floor. But Oliver was going to be predominantly lit with moving lights. There was going to be a front of house cover of Source 4s and there was going to be a psych. And actually before that, we'd done Les Mis, where we'd made it a moving light version for speed of touring. And I just said, you know, there's no point. I don't think there's any point in having a second person sitting here just turning the psych up and down. You know, I think I've got a bit better. I think the controls have got a bit better. I think we've all got a bit more experienced. I think the technology has allowed it all to link together. And I think I'd be quite happy just controlling everything. And everybody was like, you know, the producers obviously were like, great, one less person to pay. So that's my contribution to the world, I guess. But on Les Mis tour, which is about 97, which the paperwork is in one of the drop boxes, and then Oliver, which is 98, I just did everything. Somewhere in there, I invented this job title called Lighting Programmer, because I said, I'm doing all of it. I'm not doing the moving lights, I'm doing the whole thing. And it's the same process, you know, it's the same interpreting what the designer wants. And particularly with some designers who aren't, you know, I'm not knocking it, but sort of Ken Billington, American style, channel number at level, enter, channel number at level. But a generation of British lighting designers who are much more, I need some light from over there in blue. Oh, okay, I know what you mean by that. Okay, there we go. So that was sort of 2 roles conflated. And then my next step in sort of world domination was not to subsume the role of associate, but because I don't think they have to be the same role, and I don't think they always should be. So, and I think 2001, we took Oklahoma from the National Theatre into the West End, and then we took it to New York. And that was really interesting because there we had me, programmer, David lighting it, and then Ted Mather, who'd been David's American associate for maybe 10 years before that. And it was like, you know, when dogs sort of try and figure out where the other one's power status is.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Lots of different things going on, yeah.
yeah, not quite that, but in the American world with before moving lights, Ted's role had always been to take David's this blue, I will need some blue light, and he'd be the one turning it into numbers to then tell to the console operator, the union console operator, to bring the lights up. And now he's suddenly seen this other person who's just doing that. So his concern is he's being sort of cut out of this conversation, and what's his role anymore? And I, on the other hand, am going, well, I'm sitting here really busy turning these lights on, and I don't have time really to deal with drawing the plans, dealing with the follow spots, getting the light designer coffee, all the other things that an associate does. So I'm quite happy to have you here, but we both sort of have to understand that our role is slightly different, because you're allowed to have an opinion between David and me because you've been working with him for maybe longer than I have at this point. And so that was sort of interesting. And we all sort of settled down and we all got on and we all figured out that we were actually trying to work towards the same goals. So, again, in the Dropbox, I think that was the first show where we tried using digital photos to take focus plot photos, because Ted and I both talked about it, and what we both agreed was we hated walking around stage drawing little circles on pieces of paper. So we sort of bonded over that. I think the one who got the first billing for doing both jobs was actually Vic Smurden, now Vic Pine, on Billy Elliot. And that was just because she got on so well with Rick. Again, she wasn't the associate in London. She was the programmer, but by the time they got the show to New York, Rick got her the billing on the poster on the front of the theatre of lighting programmer and associate or something. Because, I think if you're the programmer who's stuck in as the translator between the designer's brain and the stage, all the information they're giving to the associate anyway is sort of already going through your brain. A lot of the management you have to do with the electrician, oh, that light's not working. Can somebody please go fix it? Well, I can just get on the radio and I can tell them that, rather than telling somebody who then tells somebody who then tells somebody else. But I think, if I was doing a big brand new show, I don't think I'd want to do both. Billy, I do both now because we've been doing the show the show has been happening for 18 years. I've been doing it for 10 years. And
it's a bit easier, isn't it, with to
when
be a programmer associate for if the show already exists, right?
Well, because what you're not having to do is sit in the middle of tech, try and make the lighting, and at the same time the designers just move 50 lights to some other position in the theatre, and somebody has to update the plan at the same time. That on an existing show that doesn't happen. Billy, we sort of turn up with a rig now, and give or take some completely unexpected weirdness, which sometimes happens, we just do the show, and at the end of it I do an updated drawing just to say here are the little silly details about this show in this venue, but I'm not having to spend all my time drawing or updating it. Follow spots, similarly, you hand them the cue sheets and you go, there you go, there's the starting point, there will be changes. When there are changes, you write them down and we'll update them. But it's not the sort of stress of making a show. Making a new show is a really high stress, high pressure environment, particularly if the show isn't very good, dare we say, or isn't going well for some other reason. And that's when the lighting designer sort of needs as many allies as they can get and as much help as they can get. I think I was thinking about this morning. I think the roles are similar in the sense that you're an interpreter of ideas and you're a facilitator, and the programmer facilitates by doing the buttons and coming up with the magic at the desk, and the associate facilitates by going, you want this to happen, okay, let me go talk to the people and figure out how we make it happen. So it's just different degrees of facilitation, I think. So it depends on the show.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, from my point of view, I think on a new show it is harder, right? Because like Hugh was saying yesterday when they were doing Matilda, you just need someone to run around and put out fires for you and solve problems. But the programmer, of course, you're stuck to the desk trying to get everything built in.
And yes. So, it depends on the situation. And the other variation of this that I now find is it doesn't really have a job title, but if you imagine let's call it the lighting designer / programmer, because to some extent, I have this crazy analogy I use where if you said to, Leonardo, right, I want you to draw the Mona Lisa, but what you have to do is describe what you want in words to somebody sitting next to you who's then using AutoCAD. You would get something that was sort of a bit like the Mona Lisa, but not the same thing.
Sure.
So it's slightly odd that we put ourselves through this process of, you think of an idea and you have to describe to me in words. And again, it's this translation thing. And words are hard. To pin down the meaning of any one word used for lighting is incredibly hard. And I then have to interpret it, and then I have to figure out how, blah, 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 and something comes out at the end. And it's this sort of constant process of refinement. And, there's maybe an argument, like, to if you wanted to give you the machine and say, you do it, because there's one less process. Now, we don't do that because, this is a general statement, all the machines we currently use are pretty terrible for actually doing lighting. If we could get a machine like the Minority Report, where we plugged an umbilical cable into your brain and it translated what you thought onto the stage, then we might be talking. But part of the reason the programmer is there is to deal with the nonsense that you have to go through to turn a light on and point it over there. And now I can't remember how I got into any of that.
Well, we were talking about Programmer Associate, and you were talking about the new role of a programmer designer.
Well, it's not a new role, but like in the old days of rock and roll, the lighting designer used to sit down at their desk with 100 faders and play the show themselves. And now they don't do that. And I think there are all kinds of really good reasons why we don't do that, which is the technology is not good enough. But more importantly, that as soon as if you sit down at the production desk with your plan and your coffee and your script, everyone else in the room perceives you as a quote unquote artist. As soon as you sit behind a machine, the danger is you get perceived as a quote unquote technician. And as soon as that happens, the conversation is different, because the conversation isn't, what's the psychological motivation of the sun rising over blah, 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 but can that be a bit brighter? And it then becomes very hard for you to do your job as lighting designer.
Yeah. But it's interesting though, what you're saying about I'm curious to see what a new generation does with those quote unquote machines, certainly you no more can you get away in a fringe venue in London without having to know how to program a moving light, because many of the lower level stuff we all do now, like when you're young, involves all that technology. And American Idiot that I did in the West End, I programmed that myself actually for
And so what I'm saying is, I don't think there's a right answer. You make a choice. So Tree of Codes, which again is in the Dropbox, but was a dance show we did for Wayne McGregor, where I have this odd job title of lighting realization because of the artist who was involved in designing it. Nobody could be called the lighting designer. And
everyone should go down your website and look at these pictures, because they're fucking awesome. The show looks incredible. And
it's an amazing show.
Very integrated and key. So everyone should go look at robhalliday.com and have a look. But it's very cool.
But on that, I went back and forth because it's Wayne McGregor, who I've never worked with before. Wayne has spent most of his life doing shows with Lucy Carter. They know exactly how to work together. Do I want to be able to have the conversation with him, or do I want to be able to show him something quickly? So what we put in place was, I had an assistant on the show who was a student, but could run the desk, with me prompting, because I'm a terrible lighting designer, because I tend to just sometimes say, do this. But also with the provision that his understanding that if it became clear that Wayne would not think of me differently, I would just run the desk. And that's actually what ended up happening. And Wayne was great. And I think Wayne really enjoyed it, because there was no fear. There was less fear of you try an idea and it's terrible, but we've just spent half an hour trying that idea. Do we dare throw it away and try something else? Because I'd just be like, great, save that somewhere else. Next, how about this? Okay, great. And what was so amazing about that show was the sort of speed at which everyone could throw an idea into the pile. You could try 6 of them, and from that, somebody would then have the 7th idea, and that's what we'd end up with. And that was completely amazing. But I think if Wayne had been a different director, I couldn't have worked like that, and the show would have probably been less good as a result. I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a whole generation who've grown up having to do it themselves, quite enjoying doing it themselves.
Yeah, well, it's for the same reason I use that same example about the Mona Lisa. I didn't know that was one of your things that you say, but I always say, I would like to hold the paintbrush if I can. Obviously, there are definitely many reasons why I shouldn't a lot of the time. But
I mean, and so where you end up is, I have this. It's like a hobby horse alert, but one of the things I'm involved with is this thing called Backstage Heritage, which is sort of trying to rescue, save, protect, display old lighting stuff. And the thing that got me completely into that was the original lighting desk they made for the National Theatre in about 1976, which is a thing called Lightboard. And Lightboard is amazing because it was custom designed for the National Theatre by a lighting designer, by Richard Pilbrow. So it's a lighting designer's tool made by a lighting designer. And what's interesting about it is it seemed to offer the best of both worlds, because the main machine was, because of the way the technology was stuck in the control room. But there was this panel you could bring out and put in front of the lighting designer, which had a bunch of wheels on it. So if they wanted to ignore it, they could. But if they wanted to get involved, they could. So, they could say, give me the cross light, the backlight, the cyc, and then they could just manipulate it directly. And then they could say, that looks great. Okay, now you record that as Q26 or whatever, and they could go back to talking to the director. But that sort of interaction has always seemed really amazing to me. And the reason I have this constant beef with technology is there were things that machine could do. Now, this is a computer with less processing power and memory than your Apple Watch now has.
Sure.
But it could do things that we still can't do, because when you assigned those things to those wheels and you recorded that into a queue, when you came back to the queue tomorrow or next week or next year or whatever, those things would reappear on the wheels. So what drives me crazy is the process we go through now, where you've lit a scene and you come back to it, in a week's time in the dress rehearsal, or in 6 months' time on tour, or in a year's time somewhere else in the world. And we have all these tools that you've been talking about all week, which are all about decoding what it is that you've put on stage. So you look at the stage and you get, fundamentally what you're doing is you're going, right, okay, the cyc's too bright. Why is the cyc too bright? Okay, first what I have to do is get some piece of paper and figure out what the channels are on the cyc. Then I have to look at the screen and figure out which of those channels are actually on. Then I have to look at the screen again and figure out why it feels like they're too bright. Then I have to actually get somebody to select them. Then I have to turn them down. Now on the light board at the National in 1976, what you'd have done is, on those wheels, one of them would be saying cyc. It's only got the lights in the cyc that are on, and you could just turn them down. And the need for magic sheets and lighting plans and light plots and hookups and pieces of paper and spreadsheets and all that stuff has completely gone away. And the process between what you want to achieve and achieving it has become dramatically minimized. And I've spent 10 years now more trying to persuade people to get that functionality back in. Because a magic sheet on an EOS is a really clever, useful tool, but it's not the same thing, because now as a programmer, you have to make this massive time investment to create it. You have to decide whether it's worth making that time investment and somebody's paying for it. And yet you still have to go looking for the information you want, whereas it should just appear in front of you. Can I do screen sharing on this?
Of course you can, yeah.
So just for historical context, so that's Lightboard from the National Theatre. So the bit on the left stayed at the control room, but that panel on the right with the 4 wheels and the white wheel, you lifted out and you carried down and you plonked it on the production desk, and the lighting designer could use it or not use it as they wanted. And again, if you just think about the process you do as a lighting designer, where you're on headset and you just want to make the site brighter, but now you're like, right, groups 107 at 40, no, at 45, or no, at 50. Why don't you just put your hand on the wheel and turn it up a little bit? Because surely, it really interests me, having looked through a lot of show files for various reasons, the number of times that everything is in a multiple of 5%, which means nobody's ever just gone, it could just be a little bit brighter.
Yeah.
And that just seems a bit sad.
Anyway, sorry. I often try to say to a programmer, can you just wheel that up just a little bit? Which A, gives them a little bit of artistic freedom to help me find that balance. And we always seem to find that quicker. I don't know. But no, you're right.
But it's interesting because, the interesting thing is I'm not knocking anybody because each to their own way of working. But there are some lighting designers now who are, how do I on screen share, who are very control freaky in a way.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but it must be like this. And then the last thing on the sort of console line designer thing is, I think what then becomes interesting, and this is, I don't know your experience of this, is when you then get to a point on a bigger enough show where you decide to let go, it becomes interesting because your interaction with the programmer is then different. I'm not, well, I will name names because I don't think you'll mind, but it was really interesting because I did a show with Howard Hudson, who's another sort of light designer who's now suddenly making it into the sphere he should have been in. And Howard has spent a lot of time doing smaller shows where he's very clearly done it himself. And now we were doing one of the shows for the Ken Branagh season, Romeo and Juliet, and I was doing it because I'd done the whole season. And it was just fascinating because, every time we'd be doing something, there was this constant drive from Howard to, come on. And I'm like, you know, I mean, I think I'm quite reasonable at this desk, and I think I sort of know what I'm doing. So yeah, and I don't think I can really do it any faster. But I think your perception is that if you were doing it, you would be doing it faster. And I'm not sure you actually would be. But of course, if you're in the middle of something, you have no awareness of the time it's taking.
Yeah, for sure.
So you know, that was a really interesting experience for me. You know, and yes, to some extent, it made me faster because I stopped faffing about a little bit. But sometimes you just wanted to go. You know, you saying be faster is not actually necessarily going to make me faster. So
in fact, it'll just make people nervous usually.
Yeah. So you know, so that was an interesting version of that as well.
It's funny. I think I went through a progression like that, and I just said like I programmed American Idiot myself, but then we did this little experiment on another show I did like a year later, another like musical that had to happen in like 2.5 days. With Dan Haggerty was programming it, but I said, could I have an ion in front of me so I could do like convention. So while I'm talking to you about focusing and moving lights, I can just wheel in group 5, like the conventional stuff, and I can like have buttons in front because I loved and I wouldn't update. I would never touch update. That was the thing I had to promise never to do. But I was allowed to like scroll through colors or push up and down levels, which I really, really enjoyed. And Dan was, so we could also work faster because he didn't worry about conventionals, didn't give a shit. He just hit update, enter.
Yeah, I mean, we did also in the folder there's a show called Jiu-Jitsu Universale, which is the thing we did in Rome, and we did the same thing. So I took a programmer who had just come out of being a student, who was brilliant and helpfully was Italian, but we didn't tell anybody that. So I had a sort of Babel fish translator spy when everyone was wittering on in Italian around me. And he got the big desk and he was doing most of the work, but I got the little desk. So for exactly that reason. So if it was easier for me to just try, rather than like color, it's really hard to explain the difference between this blue and this blue.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easier just to go, and particularly with like multicolor LEDs where how you get that blue is important. You know, I could just go or touchscreen or whatever, and then hand it all over to him. But the important thing was, and the last part of this sort of why you would do that or not is, at the moment when the director comes up to the lighting designer and wants a conversation about something, the most important thing is you have to stop and talk to them, you know, because they're like king, queen, god, whatever. And if you're the only person doing this, the problem then is A, you lose your place, and B, all work stops.
Yeah.
Whereas having the person, the programmer there is you can say, you get on with that and I'll have this conversation.
And some,
you know, and also there are 20 degrees of lighting now because Patrick Woodruff doesn't, you know, he again, not naming names, but as an example, he doesn't do what we think of as a lighting designer, where it's like this and this and this and this. He says, I want this big picture. Yeah. And then he goes off and talks to Mick Jagger for 20 minutes and feels the room and sounds out what's going on and keeps an eye on the stage. And then we'll come back and offer an opinion. You know, but again, the line between the programmer and the designer is already sort of really blurry. You know, I remember MA used to send out this big like calendar every year, which I don't know if they still do, and I've just dropped off the mailing list. But it became really interesting to look through that and just look at all the job titles that now related to lighting. You know, there was the lighting designer, there was the lighting programmer, there was the lighting director, there was the TV lighting director, there was the associate lighting designer, there was the assistant, and they all sort of, their roles shift constantly depending on what the show is and who they are. And it was just really interesting seeing the number of people and the number of slightly different things they could be called. You know, at the end of it is, you know, I sort of got to the point now where I don't think anybody really knows what, you know, outside of us, nobody really knows what the job titles necessarily mean. And outside of my mother, nobody really cares whether my name's in big letters or little letters.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of, you know, I'm quite content to be hidden away in the back of the program if I'm just the help. But I would like the job title to be correct, just so that next time I can say, yeah, this is the job I did on this show. You know, or if we're talking about money, you can go, yeah, I am sort of doing 2 jobs, sort of. You know, I'm not trying to steal somebody else's job, but, you know, I will get less rest or whatever.
Sure.
So it becomes, you have to be in the program just as a way of proving you've done it later on. But yeah, billing.
Well, and the fun thing about having you on today is you'll have done all these jobs. there isn't a job Rob hasn't done in theatre, which brings us on to you being an associate now, as well as all these other things. So how did that progression happen for you personally?
Well, as I was saying, so Oklahoma, I was sort of doing it, but without a job title because I was helping out. Um, we started doing later shows with David, where I think without even really speaking about it, he wouldn't employ an associate because he sort of knew I'd be there to do some of it. Not big shows, but like Equus, which is with Daniel Radcliffe, so it's not a big, complicated mega musical. But there was quite a lot of fiddly detail on it. But I think he sort of knew that when he got bored of drawing in Vectorworks, I could finish it off or whatever. So I think that progression sort of happened by accident or evolution or something. I don't remember formally, but like with Billy, what happened is Vic had done London as the programmer, New York as the Programmer Associate, Australia, which maybe came before New York, as the Programmer Associate. And I think she got bored of being away from home and traveling and all of that stuff. So Vic ultimately went and got a proper job at English National Opera, and out of that is now head of lighting at Glyndebourne, which is the world's best lighting job for life. Rolling, beautiful countryside, summer opera, champagne in the garden. Who could ask for anything better? Yeah. So that all worked out very well for her. But what it meant was somebody had to go look after Billy Elliot. And I had done shows with Rick before Billy Elliot. I didn't do Billy Elliot. Again, why you should always say yes. Rick had asked me to do a thing called Jerry Springer the Opera at the National. And I couldn't. Yeah, and then this was before Dan was there, and it's before the very established programmer thing happened at the National. So then it used to be much more ad hoc of sort of who was around. And same with the National has always done through its history. Whoever the electrician was who was around that day would be the board operator, as we used to call them. And I'd done a couple of shows at the National with David when the National was doing this period of doing Cameron Mackintosh musicals, which were quite complicated. So I'd go in and help them in a way that I was doing the show, but sort of helping to train them so that they were learning, which I think was sort of the start of the way the National now deals with all of that. Anyway, I couldn't do Jerry Springer for some reason. I can't remember. I suggested Vic, who I knew from somewhere. Vic and Rick got on really well. He asked her to do Billy Elliot. Great. Everyone's happy. Now there are more jobs for everyone. Makes up for the fact that we've compressed all these other roles down half the number of employment opportunities. But at the same time, there are more shows happening. So there's more jobs for everyone. But so ultimately, Rick called and said, look, Billy Elliot's going out on an American tour. It needs somebody to program it. Vic's not available. We've got the American associate, who's Dan Walker, who had done it in New York, who I already knew because it turns out this is a really small, incestuous world that we all live and work in. And the other thing in his thinking, and is a life thing. So my wife is American. I can't actually remember where the show opened. It was one of these little American tours where they tech it in a little tiny town somewhere and then move it to a bigger town to open.
Yeah, for sure.
But the little tiny town was, an hour and a half away from where my wife's parents lived. We just had our baby, and he said it would, if you want, it gives you an excuse to go see the grandparents with somebody else paying some of the flights. So you go, yeah, okay, and that's how I sort of acquired Billy Elliot, because I was there. It's an interesting collection of worlds, Billy, because the original London production looked so different from all the others because the set changed quite a lot and the rig evolved a lot, and some of the staging evolved a bit. And my experience of Billy was that original London production, whereas Dan's was of the sort of, it had become a bit glitzier Broadway version. And the rig had become dramatically downsized. So there wasn't necessarily any way you could make the show look exactly like it had in New York, because you had, I don't remember, but say half the number of lights, So you sort of, it was old school relighting, where instead of going in and saying, this light goes to here and this light does this and recreating exactly, you had to go in and say, right, it has to look sort of like this and it has to have this feel. How do we do that now with what we've got? And in some ways I could do that with a fresher eye because I hadn't seen all these other versions of the show, and it was really interesting. And there were some things I really struggled with. And so then a year or so later, Rick called and said, right, now it's going to Holland. Do you want to go and be the associate/programmer in Holland? It's back to the bigger rig. And it was really interesting walking into that rig and discovering that I could now do things that I'd had a really hard time achieving because it relied on having exactly the right light in exactly the right place, and that had been one of the sacrifices that had been made to make it tourable. So again, somebody asked this earlier, and I think you said this. It's like you make the best version at the best it can, and then you sort of deal with the other ones. That Billy tour didn't look nearly as good as Big Billy, but and part of the reason I ended up there was Rick had got the show to a point he was incredibly happy with and didn't want to go through that process of sort of roughing it up a bit.
Pulling it apart, yeah.
But it looked okay, and given the speed it moved, because it was moving every week, and given, and this is really hard to say because of course we're always striving for the best, but given that it was going to some little towns that very rarely got, never got the full version of the Phantom of the Opera, they always, to exaggerate, what they got was the local amateur dramatics and Billy Elliot. Well, we look good in that context, so I was quite happy with it. But I've sort of done Billy ever since, because I now know the little version and I know the big version and I know the versions in between. But also from the little version, when we came back to the big version, I was able to sit with Rick and the big plan and say, okay, now I see how this all worked, but I still think we can downscale this a bit. So Billy Holland is, okay, I can't remember again, but maybe 10 or 15 moving lights less than the biggest versions had been before that. And then beyond that, I was able to then do what we all have to start doing now, which is to look at it and say, okay, maybe now is the time to take down these scrollers and put in lusters. Do we think that could work? Now is the time to take down the VL2000s and put in some LED version. So auras is what we use in the end. Does that work? Okay, go do the trials, look at it, facilitate it again. Ultimately, Rick makes the decision, but you end up with enough trust with him that if I say the XB, the aura will be a working replacement for the VL2000, he will trust me enough, I think, to say, okay, let's do it. And as a result of that, the maintenance on the show plummets because the VL2000s at this point are a 10-year-old light. Billy's a really interesting show because there are a few lights that we really need to replace, but we can't. The workhorse of the show is the big VL3500 shuttering spotlight. And there are cues in the show where there is exactly one light on. It's a VL3500. It's at maximum zoom and then shuttered in a little bit to do one big single full stage backlight. What's important to Rick is that single shadow look, and nobody currently makes a moving light that will go that wide. So we can't achieve that moment in the show any other way, and that's really important to Rick. It's interesting because we are.
It's just Billy Elliot.
Yeah. Now the problem is, Billy Elliot isn't Hamilton anymore. I can't go to the manufacturer and say there will be 6 companies of this show around the world in the next 2 years anymore, because there won't. There should currently be one in Japan, but it's been coronavirus. And the interesting learning curve we're about to have is that we're trying to figure out how we can light that show remotely from here via Zoom. With people there who've done it before. But with some new equipment, and because we don't think we can get into Japan, and even if we get into Japan, we'd have to sit in a hotel room for 2 weeks before we could actually go do any work. So that's my new lighting challenges you never thought you'd have to deal with 2020 style.
Well, it's so exciting, and it's great to hear that Rick that within your role, Rick trusts you to go out and try to facilitate all those changes. Is there?
Well, I think again, I think it's a really odd job, isn't it, being the associate? Because you have to have enough. It's like you have to have enough freedom to be able to hang yourself. If you're there and the director, again, who's the person or the associate or whoever, but the artistic person in charge comes up and says, right, I've decided that 10 years all those people have been standing over there, and now I'm going to put them over there. You have to figure out how to deal with that in the style of Billy Elliot or Rick Fisher or whatever. It's no good going, oh, right, now I'm going to, this scene I suddenly think should be pink. That will get you fired quicker than you can possibly imagine.
For sure.
Well, unless the director turns out to prefer it as well. So there it's interesting because you can't even offer it. But I think, you sort of have to prove yourself enough that you are trusted to deliver in their style. And I think the interesting career progression is this sort of climbing inside somebody else's brain, because the other thing you have to do is you have to, you walk into Billy Elliot and you have to go, okay, now I click Rick Fisher mode. But when I walk into, old Les Mis, I have to go click, now I'm in David Hersey mode or whoever, and understanding what it means by that. And I think, again, I was thinking about this morning as well. The part of that understanding isn't necessarily just knowing the color or knowing the focus charts or knowing the really practical written detail, but and this is why it's useful, I think, being there from the beginning. It's remembering the sort of half-heard conversations, always. So Les Mis, original Les Mis, as I now call it, when we moved it from the Palace to the Queen's Theatre, and there was just something, because Les Mis, as a show, what you don't realise until you see it broken is it never goes dark. It always had a reputation as being a dark show, but it wasn't. It was a really tightly, precisely lit show. So you were only ever looking at exactly where you were meant to look. And there was a scene change happening 6 feet away, but you didn't see it. But it never went dark. And when we moved it to the Queen's, the dimmers were different and the curves were different and they were old dimmers and it was all a bit ropey. And the first pass, you suddenly become aware that instead of this constant driven through flow of a story, it was going like this. And it was David who said, the thing is, it's going dark. Every transition, because of the curve of the dimmers, it's dipping through dark and it shouldn't do that. So you go, all right, fine, how do we fix that? Curve in the desk, fix that, great, now it looks fine. But it would never have occurred to me that that was the goal. Similarly, Billy, we were focusing it one day and Rick said, because I'm doing what you do, which is to cut the lights into the front of the stage, the front of house cover. And Rick was just like, no, bring it in a bit. I like a dark border around the stage. And you go, all right, okay, file that away. If you look really closely at the focus notes, you could sort of tell that, but file it away as an important thing to the lighting designer, because that's what the useful things you can remember later. I hate to say it, but however good the paperwork is, and the ambition is somebody who's never done the show before should be able to walk in and relight it. But I don't think anybody has ever actually quite achieved that.
Well, there's always going to be something in the way, isn't there? There'll be something in the theatre that will mean that it won't be exactly the same. So someone's going to have to reinterpret that note. You're right. It's all about intention. All that data.
Yeah, and so the thing I put in focus notes now, really importantly, is the things that you would think are mistakes. So if there's a shutter cut that's halfway across a door, which is for some really good reason, you have to really note that in the focus notes, because otherwise the next person is going to look at the photo or the drawing and go, well, that's clearly it just slipped that day. Now that maybe looked better, but it's wrong in the context of the show. So it's drawing attention to all the weird stuff, all the stuff that's, again, I think there's a difference between, and this is a very generic statement, but American designers where it's all the very regimented systems, and a lot of British designers where it's much more the little quirky thing and the little quirky angle, and which, coming back to the thing at the National yesterday, I think comes back to the freedom of learning your craft at the National, where there's a light everywhere. If you suddenly decide you need this light from over here, you don't have to go fight anybody to get it. It's probably just there sitting waiting for it. And equally, you can craft your show in little tiny pools of light, knowing that if somebody, the director, the producer, the writer, whoever, suddenly goes, oh, it all needs to be big and bright, the stuff is there to do that. Broadway, there's always been this slight historical sense that you have to cover yourself, because to come back and add light later, historically, because of all the union stuff, has been really expensive. Sure. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and they like hundreds of spares and stuff like that, which is always interesting.
Yeah, because just in case, and because it's quicker to have them there.
And why do you think, in general, now we're just talking in generalities, do you think American rigs are bigger? Is it because the shows are more commercial, or because?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's also a difference between American and Broadway.
Sure.
I think Broadway is such a peculiar law unto itself. Yeah. And I think, you can go around the pros and cons of it forever, and you can end up in all kinds of trouble with all kinds of people. But fundamentally, we've done the numbers on shows that we've taken from London to New York, so identical physical production. And the cost of putting it on in New York is 3 or 4 times more to take the same scenery into the same theatre with the same lights and turn the same lights on. And the British part of you goes, that's just, the puritanical Brits, that's just ridiculous. This is outrageous, because then, of course, what you then do is you look at the ticket price and you discover that, in the West End, I don't know the numbers now, but say the West End is £20 and the same show in Broadway is $80. Well, that's 2.5, 3 times the price because they have to pay for all of this stuff. And again, you go, that's ridiculous because all these, poor students and young people don't get to see the show. And then you look at how much the Broadway lot are earning and you go, that's just ridiculous. How are you earning? How is again, exaggerated numbers, don't quote these as gospel, but, how is the house guy in the theatre who's running the follow spot earning $100,000 a year? Whereas the equivalent person in London is like the student who's doing it between college shifts, who's earning, I don't know, again, £400 a week. And in Britain, you go, that's just ridiculous. But when you actually think about it, you go, actually, we're the ones who are wrong. Because do you know what? Hamilton on Broadway is still selling out. Even though their premium super excess price ticket is $400, $500, $600, it's still full because it's a good enough show. Yeah. And so why shouldn't the people who have worked very hard, and some of them work very hard every night to deliver that show to a quality, be properly paid? And, the argument is not well paid, but actually properly paid, because during a Broadway load-in, they're there at 8 in. Quite often they're there till midnight, some of it. They work really hard, and we're so used in England, in this country, to sort of being beaten down. Our theatre, it's like,
for love, not money.
Yeah. The love, not money. It's the struggle. It's the art. It's the da-da-da. And you go, okay, I get all that. But funny enough, if you look in the Sunday Times rich list, Andrew Lloyd Webber's way up there and Cameron Mackintosh is way up there. So clearly there is money in theatre. But it just, the first time I went to America, which was with my little touring company in 1992, we played the Chicago Festival, which was a union house. But we'd all been brought over. And we'd all got visas and we were all there to do our show, and we walked into the theatre, and my job on the show as the boy, as the second electrician, was to go around and put all the side light on all the stands and focus all that up, and smoke machines and all the stuff on stage. So I just walked in and started doing that, and this whole crew were like, can't do that. And you're like, okay, well, why am I here then? Well, you're not in the union, you can't touch the stuff. You go, okay, fine, well, what would you like me to do then? And they said, well, I want to know what else needs to be done. So again, we figured out that in the old day of tech, we'd always toured the show on an English light desk. They were doing it on a light palette. We didn't have a disc. We had a printout. So somebody would have to sit and type the show into this light palette. And I said, well, can I do that? And they're like, oh, no, because touch and gear, union's not allowed. And you're like, this is just ridiculous. I said, well, can I take an electrician? Oh, no, we're all busy rigging the lights. Okay, well, I could do, okay, fine. And I said, well, who can we get? And they said, oh, well, we've got somebody who's in wardrobe, who's in the right union, but, worked a light palette in college 4 years ago. She can come and do it. So I didn't know a light palette from Adam at that point. So she and I sat there and jumbled through getting this show in. But you'd go, this is just crazy. Now, where you start to get a hint of the power of, so this is going to become more unions and political now, but the power of the unions is, in our company, the lowest of the low were the acting ASMs, acting assistant stage managers. So they were on stage, but they were also the ASMs. And in the UK, they were the lowest paid. So they were on the absolute equity minimum, which I think then was £250 a week. This is a long time ago. In America, everybody went on to the American equity minimum, but they went on to the American stage management equity minimum. So those two lowliest of the low people were now earning more than the star actor who ran the company. And you were like,
yeah, great.
Second time I went to America, which was on a commercial show, we were working with, in England, there was always this legendary American production electrician who owned 2 Porsches. That was the legend. And it turns out it's true. He's called Bobby Fairback. He was the production electrician in America for Cats, Saigon, Les Mis, Phantom, all the tours. So he'd earned his money. and I happened to get on with him really well. And it's slightly odd because, you know, he turned up at the first load-in all dressed in white. And you're like, that's an odd choice for a production electrician, if you don't mind me saying so. And he said, you know, the thing is, if I arrive in the theatre dressed like this, the guys know I'm not actually going to be doing like getting dirty, and therefore I must be in charge. And you go, okay, interesting. And then I got taken away for the talk because by now I'd had to be let into the union to do this show. And they said, you know, you Brits think we're all crazy, but the thing is, you know, producer decides to do the show. We work really hard to deliver the show. If the show's a hit, the producer becomes incredibly wealthy. And if the show's a flop, we've still done the same amount of work. We just think we should be properly recompensed for that. And that some of that sticks. You know, at the same time, when you get to a lunch break in New York and everybody stops for lunch,
Amazing.
That's amazing. And what you find is at the end of the afternoon, you're much less grumpy than you are in London because you've actually had lunch.
Yeah.
And so what I found is when you come back to London and the production manager for the 5th day in a row is like, well, it's all gone wrong and we're running behind and da-da-da-da-da. So you lighting are now just going to have to work through lunch to catch up. Some part of you goes, surely that just means you didn't schedule this properly.
For sure.
I mean, you know, if there's an emergency, I'm completely happy to work through lunch. But if it's happening again and again and again, then somebody just hasn't thought about it properly. And, you know, I don't become militant about it, but I just become a bit more muttery under my breath about it, doing shows in London.
I also think if by not having a union, it kind of means that the management doesn't really have to know what's going on. Like somehow having all these rules in place forces young producers to actually acknowledge that this
and
a certain amount of time. Or
New York production managers work much, much harder because the financial pressure if they make a wrong decision is so incredibly higher, and then they have to go answer to the producers.
Yeah.
You know, so they have a much, 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 much tougher job. Now, the thing that's most interesting, just from a sort of observing it viewpoint. So, you know, my wife's American. She works in theatre. She does props for like Harry Potter and all those big shows. And she's been through this. And because I then explained how I saw it to her, she now explains it to all the other incoming Americans. Which is, if you're in a Broadway theatre, there's this constant noise of the crew talking very loudly to each other as they describe at the top of their voices what they're doing. Hey, I'm just going to rig the thing. I'm just going to do the thing. And there's this sort of running commentary, which I think, and again, my personal opinion, and I'll probably get lynched by some union dude later. It's their way of reinforcing to the producer that they're all there working hard.
Yeah.
Whereas in London, what happens is everybody shows up, they all get quietly on with their jobs. At 11 o'clock, whatever, they all quietly go have a cup of tea. They come back and they quietly get on with their jobs. And at lunchtime, they go and have lunch. Now, Americans who bring shows into this mix get completely freaked out because they're convinced that nothing is happening and all these lazy, useless Brits are just idling around doing nothing. And you always have to take them aside. You know, my version of the American talk is to take them aside and say, just watch. It is all happening. It's just happening without the sort of running commentary going on. Because maybe it's just a character thing. Maybe it's because we are getting paid and we feel less need to justify it, you know. I'm not saying they're wrong. I think we should be paid better. I think, you know, in a big musical particularly, the most important contribution moment to moment in a show is how good the follow spot operator is. You know, that person shouldn't be the worst paid person in the room. Because if they mess up, 1,000 other people are going to know about it really quickly. And so I think we need to constantly be sort of trying to drive how much we get up. You know, and I think the interesting thing is, I think in this country in particular, the lighting people have always been really good at talking to each other about that. And, you know, hey, how much are you getting for this? And understanding that, you know, if you undercut somebody else, you're actually doing everybody a disservice because what you're doing is lowering the value of the job. You know, the thing with, again, Mary and props is we quite quickly learned that they got paid much less per day than we did. And I just kept saying, this is silly because you're there the same number of hours, you're doing the same amount of work. How do we, you know? And there was a brilliant conversation she had with the production manager one day where the production manager was like, right, we're doing this new show, and, you know, fees, how much? And she eventually just said, you know, Richard, you know, I think I'll be quite happy having the same as the production electrician. And you just heard him splutter because he knew the game was up. You know, he knew that she knew. and he knew that he couldn't try and persuade that everybody was earning the same amount of money anymore. And I think everybody across all departments post now needs to do it, because the danger is everyone's going to go, we're all so poor, all the fees have to come down, and we all need to try and make sure that doesn't happen. But also we all sort of need to make sure it all gets evenly distributed amongst everybody, I think. Sorry, that's all gone a bit political there. So.
No, it's good to hear all that stuff. It's really valuable. Yeah, and you're right. It's we've been talking this whole week a lot about like American ways of working and British ways of working. And I just think it's important for everyone listening to just try to find the best of both those worlds and make it the best.
Yeah, I mean, there's a generation of British people who don't have any understanding of the power of the union. This is really, and this is, it's funny because it's political, but it's also actually the subplot of Billy Elliot, which is the miners who had a really powerful union who chose to go into battle with a political leader who chose to destroy them, by sending in the police and sending in the riot police and destroying an industry. And because of that, the difference is now beyond theatre is if in London the tube trains go on strike, everyone's like, oh, tube drivers, oh, they're ruining my life, oh, I can't get to work. If in New York the tube drivers go on strike, there's a bit more of a sense of, up the power of the union, they should be getting paid more money. And it's that sort of social divide that makes it really hard for people who work in the arts and culture and all that art stuff to actually say, I think I'd like to earn a decent, well, not even decent, reasonable living. And you can do that. It's the very fact that in this government bailout for freelancers, some people have said, I can't claim because I'm earning too much, proves that the people who work really hard and are really committed and have been doing it for a long time and have got into a good position and blah, 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 are earning a reasonable living. But it's just it's the range from top to bottom that's too wide at the moment that I think we need to do something about. And, we need to, I don't know if you talked about this as well, but this really weird thing where on any given show, probably the programmer has earned much more than the light designer during the process of making the show. Now, hopefully the show then runs 20 years and the light designer makes it all up in royalties because the programmer doesn't get any. But that feels wrong to me because I'm there to serve.
We should all get paid for our time, like the same. Like the royalty is the art, is paying for using of the art, which is a different fee, right? But we should all get paid for our time, at least closer to what it is now.
Well, there was a show we did. We didn't do it in the end, but there was a show we got asked to do in somewhere in America, San Diego, I think. Which it was the show Finding Neverland. So it was meant to open in San Diego. Neil Austin got asked to light it. He asked Dan Walker to be the associate, and he asked me to be the programmer. And we all looked at our fees, and because of the weird rep structure thing, and again, I can't remember the numbers, but let's just invent some easy numbers. Neil was going to get paid, say, $1,000 to light the show. Dan was going to get paid $2,000 to be the associate, and I was going to get paid $5,000 to be the programmer. And that's just bonkers. And I said, between us, because we're all friends, I said, why don't we just all agree to that, or take the money, or put it in a big pot, and then just between us, just split it. And everyone was like, yeah, are we allowed to do that? Like slightly naughty school children looks. But I was like, I'm fine with it, because I don't want to be going to dinner every day and feeling that I'm the one who has to buy dinner, because, now in the end, the show didn't happen, and so it did happen in Leicester and a whole different set of pay things. But it's things like that I think everybody needs to have a discussion about, but of course nobody really wants to, because the programmers are afraid that they're going to end up getting paid less money, and the designers are afraid that somebody's going to try and tap into their royalty, and and having really open and frank proper conversations about money, turns out, is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Maybe that can be next year's whole course.
The business side of it. We've done the curating side of lighting. Now we're going to do the business side. But also, I think we have the ALD with us today at 5:30, so we can launch back into all that stuff. Can I ask you about Tree of Codes, the beautiful show that you lit? So you were the designer of this show, and everyone's been on your website already and looked at the pretty pictures. But it's something that you've relit, everywhere, for yourself as a designer and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so Tree of Codes, again, in my slightly odd career, because the last part, so the associate lighting designer thing is, I think I've always, when I set out at the beginning, I set out to be a lighting designer, and somewhere along the way I got distracted by all this programming, assistant-y, associate-y stuff, because it paid the rent. And every now and again I sort of go, right, everyone remember I'm a lighting designer. And I go do a few shows, and then something happens, you know, so somebody calls and says, come and do Les Mis in Australia and we'll pay you loads of money, and you go, oh, that sounds like fun. Or, you know, you have a kid and you suddenly go, okay, sod all this art, I need to pay for my existence, what jobs can I do? As a result of all of that, Tree of Codes happened because Jack Thompson, who runs the Manchester Festival, who I'd done 2 shows for before then, I think, and who I've known forever, called and said, look, we're doing the show. It's a weird combination of people. It's Oliver Eliasson, this amazing visual artist, is the designer. He's the lighting designer as well. But we need an interface between his mind and theatre lighting, and that's what you do. Do you want to come and do it? And you go, yeah, okay. So I invented this job title called Lighting Realization because, again, nobody really cares apart from my mother, you know. So, but in essence, it was to take Oliver's, what he showed in the model and what he showed on this sort of 10-page document, and then to talk to Wayne, the director choreographer, and to try and figure out what it was we were going to achieve and how we were going to achieve that. And as part of that, just to add to the complication, when the show was playing in Manchester, it was going to have a second show playing on top of it, which is The Tale of Mr. Tumble, a BBC CBeebies kids show. So the rig also had to be able to accommodate that. Ollie Fennick, who I've worked with a lot, was lighting that. And it was sort of, I arrived at that I would stay on and program that show since I'd know the rig. So what I said to Ollie is that, why don't you just let me design a rig, present it to you, and then we can argue about it, you know, which is a sort of poor man's version of like the National Theatre rep system. You know, and that's what we did. And our show is incredibly complicated because the show is basically these 3 surfaces. So at the back, there's a mirror. In the middle that flies in and out, there's a half mirror. And at the front, there's this strange multicolored dichroic perspex thing that's the width of the pros. So for us, it was all about getting in between these things to light the dancers. And did you light the things deliberately? Like, did you want to see light bouncing off the mirror? Well, Oliver seems to, you know, maybe we did. So we need to put some lights in to do that. And that's quite a lot of weird section drawing, and angles and incidence equals reflection. But also you sort of needed flexibility, you know. So Oliver would talk a lot about white light, and it sounds like the biggest cliche in the world, but you go, okay, so what do we all mean by white light? You know, do you mean this white, or do you, if I turn this light on, do you mean, you know? So I sort of arrived at this would be a good use for the luster twos, not necessarily to do color, but because you could just bend white light to whatever way everyone needed it to. And I sort of knew that we'd be making the show up on the run. So like everything now, you needed some moving lights. I sort of knew that, you know, we'd have to cut off these shiny panels. So we needed moving lights with shutters. You know, it's interesting because I go through this a lot with people about whether lighting is art or craft. And it's sort of equal parts both, you know, because there's a very definite craft of you need to solve this problem and get this here and have this here. And then at the same time, there's the art of what you're actually trying to achieve with that. But we put together a rig that I thought would do that. We sorted out the practical stuff. The psych, you know, was a very practical issue because we only had this much space, but I knew how to solve that because we'd solved that problem 8 years earlier for Mary Poppins with this even LED psych tile thing. And I knew that it was sitting in the warehouse at White Light. So you go, hey, can I rent that? And they're like, happy to have it out of the warehouse. How much would you like? You know, and we arrived in Manchester slightly nervous because there were sort of 3 sets of things going on. There was Wayne's choreography. There was the music by Jamie XX of the band The XX, a lot of which was really up-tempo, the electronic-y stuff. Wayne's choreography wasn't necessarily doing that, and Oliver's set wasn't doing necessarily either of those 2 things. So this is the thing where, you know, David Hersey has this brilliant expression about lighting is the glue that sticks the whole production together.
That's brilliant.
And that's sort of what we were. And so you arrive in Manchester with a bunch of ideas and everyone else's thoughts. And the complication was Oliver was only available for like 3 days at the beginning before the dancers arrived. So then we had these amazing 3 days that you never normally get, where you just went into the theatre. It was like you locked the door and you shut out the outside world. You had some walkers on stage, which I never normally get in drama. And you just, like I said earlier, everyone just started throwing ideas in the air, and I'd sit in the middle and we'd just sort of try them out. And it was that absolute best of collaboration when nobody was afraid to say anything, however stupid it might sound, because something else would come out of it. You know, so the example is one of the pictures which has the dichroic wall at the front with these 2 rotating discs. And I had, when that's happening, it's a really, really up-tempo bit of music. And I'd done all kinds of, should it be flashing, should it be pulsing, should it be something, should it be something? And, you know, irising on the thing and lights moving around the thing. And Oliver was the one who said, no, this is all very good, but maybe what we do is we just take the things and slow it all right down and just make them go round the circles. So these 2 little irised circles of light. And the CD that, it says, now make one go the other way. So now what you have is these all for this 5-minute sequence of the show, these little circles of light just going round and round, like orbiting planets. You know, and what's important to him is that they're slightly different sizes, so it's not just 2 moving light circles. They're slightly different colors, so they're like planets. They're going in opposite directions. And the thing that you don't realize, you know, this happy accident is later on when we were redoing the show, I just left it running while I was doing something else. And at some point, these 2 planets collided. And it was like, you know, apocalysmic. You know, that never happens in the show. And as soon as it happened, it suddenly was like, that's wrong. And you go, why have I never seen that before? It turns out in the timing of things in the show, it just so happens that they never get in sync with each other because they're running at slightly different speeds. So we made the show, and then Oliver went away, and then the dancers came, and then we dealt with actually lighting the dancers. And then, you know, that was a whole learning curve about things that, again, they don't teach you in lighting school, because on the last dress rehearsal, I get Wayne, who I'd never worked with before, giving me a hard time because he said, it's like you can't feel the energy, and I think it's the lighting. And you're like, oh my God, that's one of those notes, you know, how do I deal with that? And we had a brilliant lady who's like the costumey person, and she was there, and she said, Wayne, I think the problem is, you know, your dancers are brilliant, but they know when they have to do it full out, and they know when not to, and they're not doing it. And because they're not doing it, they're not sweating. And what you're missing is the glow you get when the dancers just have a surface on. And the next day when they went full out, I didn't change anything. And Wayne was like, you know, those notes when they then go, yeah, well done, that's amazing now. And you're like, you're welcome.
Fixed it.
Fixed it. Redoing that show around the world, I mean, it's really interesting because we've done it in lots of different venues, some of which are normal theatres, some of which are places like the Park Avenue Armory in New York, which is a big open space, some of which are much smaller theatres. You know, we sort of adapt the rig, but, you know, what's interesting is the 2 important things in the show are that the moment where the things reflect off the reflective surfaces, excuse me, you can't beat physics, you know? So in Manchester, the light that did this happens to be on the circle front, and you get that reflection. In New York, where there's a big rake seating bank, if you draw that light in the same place, it's in the middle of row K, like in a seat. And the amazing thing about this show being art rather than a commercial show is you go to them and say, look, I really need to put 2 lights in row K. And also then we need to take off some seats behind them. And they go, yeah, okay. And you're like, all right then. But then it becomes another lesson in architecture, you know, because all the Asian theatres we've done all have big seating banks like this, and you end up fighting about a seat. Except if you go to Hong Kong, where all the theatres are modelled on British theatres, and the circle front is at about the height it is in Manchester, mysteriously. So suddenly it all just works again. So that's the one, you know, my whole life on this show before we do it is fighting about the, you know, I draw the plan, and they say we can't afford it, and then we go through that. But then I go, I need these lights, and that becomes a whole fight. And then the other thing is for the opening 5-minute sequence of the show, when they're all wearing these like LED light suits, what we want is absolute pitch darkness everywhere else. like proper black, no secondary lights, no exit lights, nothing. And then the exit lights we need to keep off for the rest of the show, so you don't just see exit lights in all these mirrors. And man, that's hard work, you know, because nobody believes it can be done. We did it in Manchester because the Manchester Festival looked brilliant. Manchester, we had this amazing accident where it was a guy at the stage door with a big switch and a radio, and he'd turn it off on cue, and at the end of the 5-minute sequence he'd get the call and he'd turn it on, and he was there all the time, so if there's an emergency, at the end of 5 minutes I hear the call get given to turn the lights back on. I notice they haven't come back on. I make the really naughty decision not to tell anyone, and we do the rest of the show, which is another hour and 20 minutes in, I mean, not in complete dark obviously because the stage is lit, but it was the single most focused audience I've ever seen in my life, because all those little things that are always just sort of right on the edge of your vision and distracting you without you being aware of it weren't there. And the next day we did it, we got in a small amount of trouble and we did it properly, and the show wasn't as good because the audience weren't, you know. So the next day we went and fought the fight. I mean, Jack Thompson, I don't know how he did it, but to be able to do that for the whole show, and it went back to being amazing again. But everywhere we go now, it just becomes about turning these lights.
All the regulations, all the modern regulations, right, are so insane. Like any of these new theaters, they have to be so bright even when the show's on.
Yeah, but it's all the tricks you learn about, you know. So like one venue, I persuaded them that having the exit lights on was more dangerous, because if you could see the exit sign on stage, you'd think there was a fire exit that way. Right, there wasn't. You know, in the Garnier in Paris, there was this brilliant translator interpreter lady called Gabrielle, who's quite new to doing it, who got assigned to me, and I think regretted it immediately, because I was like, right, so now because of course the production manager and everybody else loses interest quite quickly, but it's a really big thing to me. So I was like, right, we're going to sort this out. So we go find the crew, and they're like, no, auditorium is the front of house man, you need to talk to him. So we find the front of house man. He's like, no, cannot do. Okay, who do we talk to? Oh, you need to talk to the director. Expecting I'll shut up. And I'm like, right, where do we find him? So off we go. We find the director in his, you know, office overlooking Paris, Eiffel Tower in the distance. And I say, we need to da-da-da-da-da. He goes, not even the great Robert Wilson, like the American artist, has been able to turn off these lights. And, you know, I have this sort of street fighting nature of having done 20 years of roughy tufty touring, and I go, here's the thing, I don't need to turn them off. I just need to not see them. So my proposal would be that you have, like old school, a guy with a stick with a thing on it, like this. And I know that in this theatre you employ a big fireman crew, and it seems to me they could do it. And you just, in his face, you see him go, Yeah. And some phone calls are made, and the next thing we know, you know, there was one particular one right at the back of the upper circle. The next thing you know, there's a bunch, we can see in the mirror, there's a bunch of firemen up there, and they've clearly been told to do this, and they've clearly gone to that. So they're up there gaff taping over this.
The firemen.
Now I'm convinced if you went back, so 4 years later, probably that exit sign's still covered up. You know, and I don't really care because it achieved what I needed it to achieve. But it's, you know, it's hard work on that show, but it's really hard to explain why it's worth it until you're in that room and you experience it, because it connects you to the show, because the show wins over everything else, and it's really amazing.
Well, the pictures.
Anyway, have a look. If you look through the plans, you'll see how that rig is sort of.
Well, we're in our last little chunk here before we all let you go. Anyone got any questions they want to type in for Rob? Rob, do you want like a little 2-minute pee break or anything? Are you okay?
No, I'm good. Keep going. Programmers don't.
No, that's right. You're used to this. Yeah, have a look through those drawings, guys, and ask Rob some questions. Anything about Billy Elliot or relighting Tree of Code. Rob, you listened to our chat this morning on relighting doors and stuff. Yeah, have you got any other tips and tricks up your sleeve you can tell people
No, I mean, relighting, I think understanding the context rather than just the numbers, like I said earlier, is really important. I think understanding how the technology can help you is really important. You know, like again, I've been arguing with this about ETC for 10 years now, but the standard scenario is you've got these two cross booms with a bunch of moving lights on them, and you plonk them down on stage, and for whatever reason they're slightly on the wonk. And what you're saying is where you say, right, and then what you do is put them in the lineup and just physically manhandle the boom or ladder back so it all lines up will save you an infinite amount of time. And that's true, and that's great. But sometimes you can't do that because of the architecture of the building. What ETC will let you do in a really convoluted way is take the lights, point them back to a lineup position. Then you have to manually figure out how much you've moved them. But then you can do one command that applies that correction to all the presets in the show. So you've moved all the lights by that amount. And it won't be dead on accurate, but what it at least means is when, if you rush into the first performance, this light won't be pointing into some old lady's eyes in row 6. It will at least be roughly pointing towards the stage. And my argument for 10 years has been to say, why do I have to, in Excel, write down all these differences? Why can't I take all these lights, point them back to that place, my lineup point, and say, you update everything by this amount. And then the job will be done in 20 seconds. Because the thing is, again, it drives me crazy that if you imagine every weekend in Britain, I don't know, 20 shows move to a new venue, and 20 people are sitting there spending hours going, update, update, update. That is slightly ridiculous.
I math to solve that problem, right?
Yeah, and maybe augment the sort of the visualizer thing in EOS, which is, is good, and has only been, I've been using it for the last year. There's this big show I'm doing in Thailand that was out of the way enough that we thought we could try it without anybody knowing about it. But also, the time difference meant that if something went drastically wrong, I could report it at the end of my day. They could fix it during their day, and I could have a new version at the beginning of the next day, which did actually turn out to be quite useful. Maybe that will help, but the process. This is what I mean by the technology is disappointing, because it feels like it doesn't always quite understand what it is we're actually trying to achieve. It's a lot of numbers and buttons and things, but what we're actually trying to achieve is this amazing looking thing on stage. So the example I give is if you as a light designer craft this state where there's a bunch of cross light and this side is warm and this side is cool. It looks amazing. And then the director shows up, or the set designer, and says, oh, I'd imagine the sun was over there. What you now have to do is swap all these colors to here and all these colors to here. That's an incredibly hard thing to do, because there's a third step involved where you have to remember what the color is. But it's a thing a version of a thing we do all the time. So why can't you just go, I want to take that and swap the color? And that would be an incredibly useful tool. Now, the danger now is lots of the programmers would go, but if you have that power, you don't need me. My job is to do that. And you go, well, it is, but surely if you could do it quicker or faster, it'll be better for all of us.
Hey, Jason is asking, have you got any tips on ways of reducing a rig without compromising the design?
Well, I think this sounds really obvious. The first thing is make sure you've actually used all the lights, because sometimes it turns out, particularly with conventionals, but sometimes it turns out you haven't. Make sure you're using all the moving lights more than once, because otherwise it might as well be a source 4 or something. And that sounds obvious, but it's surprising, in the heat of the moment of tech, how sometimes that light that's sort of tucked up there around the corner you forget about. So, do that sort of first base level stuff first. It's interesting. There's a question somebody asked earlier about, if a light show goes on tour, adding more moving lights to replace conventionals. I've always had this theory that moving lights are really good for making a show, but they're quite high maintenance once the show is just running. So actually what you want to do is make the show, figure out what all the lights do, close the show for a week, take all the lights down, put up enough conventionals to cover you, focus them, and then you would never have to go fix a broken moving light ever again. But nobody's ever actually allowed me to do that. And in fact, this week, the opposite is happening, which is, you'll find a picture of this on Twitter. So Phantom of the Opera in London, which is probably the last of the original musical theatre lighting rigs in London. So it's been in there since 1980.
Everyone should go see this as a project and just see what lighting design was like in, 87?
Well, you can't, because they've just taken...
Oh, no way!
They've taken everything out. They're going to give the theatre a good going over while it's closed, and then they're probably going to put the touring rig back in. So you've missed your moment to see the last great original
That's
piece of lighting.
so hard to start.
And beyond that, it's just analysis. I just will sit down with like a big spreadsheet, or I mean, we haven't talked about it, but this focus track thing I made, which is like the thing Andy then made, Moving Light Assistant you've been looking at, and just get into the detail of, there's two lights next to each other. If this one's on when this one's off, and this one's off when this one's on, then you can start to say, well, maybe actually I can rationalize them together. And there will always be a compromise a little bit when you do that, but it's how much of a compromise you make. Billy, one of the things we did was we discovered that there were some big Verilight wash lights that weren't working very hard, and there were some big Verilight spots next to them that when the wash lights were on, the spots weren't generally. So we could sort of merge those two things in together. Now, a spot at full zoom in soft edge doesn't quite look like a wash, but it's probably near enough. So yeah, it's really boring. It's just working through and seeing what isn't working enough to earn its keep, and getting rid of it.
So this is our last day together, sadly. Have you got any tips on further learning for people who want to read more or learn more about how to get into programming or being an associate or an assistant, stuff like that?
Well, I'm sure the thing is I haven't heard all the sessions, but I did. Sarah or Dan yesterday said the thing about having somebody be the light designer when you're the programmer. That for programming, that's the most important thing, because if you sit down with a desk or the offline or whatever, and you're setting yourself tasks to do, you very quickly subconsciously set yourself things you already know how to do. And then you're very proud because you go, look, I've done it. And then you get put next to a light designer who asks you to do something slightly different, and you're like, ah! And that's the worst time to go to pieces, because you're trying to establish this relationship with the designer. So have somebody else be the lighting designer while you practice. I mean, or the Hamilton thing that ETC have put up is a really interesting idea. They've also have another thing on the website, which is Ken Billington on one of his shows, like the cans recorded, so you can hear him banging onto the programmer. I don't know if they've done that for Hamilton, but that would also be really interesting to actually have the sort of time pressure in you. Because again, doing this in your room when you've got all day to do it, it's easy. Doing it when 20 people are yelling at you and somebody's yelling at him and the band are waiting, and that's much harder. I think be in the room. Almost everybody. Well, again, this is going to be interesting post-COVID when everyone's much more controlling about their bubbles. But traditionally, if you call a light designer and say, hey, can I come and hang out for a few days, we'll almost always say yes. And just being in the room is worth an infinite amount of anything, because of how people work and the politics and the time pressure and the who gets on and who doesn't and who's falling out, and just be there. And most people most of the time are quite amenable to that, as long as you know when to shut up. The skill of that is knowing when is a good time to ask a question and when is you just need to stay out of the way because something's going on that somebody just needs to resolve. And I think reading is always helpful, but this is going to sound like a blatant plug, but it isn't, because the book doesn't exist yet. But I'm doing a book at the moment which is trying to talk about things that nobody ever talks about, because I realized that I've never read anything about lighting design which talks about getting an agent, for example. So we're trying to do a book which is sort of 50 things they don't teach you in lighting school.
Business side of it, for sure.
Well, it's both. What we're trying to do is the business side of it from that point of view, and then the art side of it by talking to Rick and John Clark and people, and in a really interesting long form interview where you just let them talk. Because what you get out of that is, you discover that John Clark's take on color is completely different from somebody else's take on color, but neither of them are wrong. And the book's sort of notionally called Advanced Lighting Design, but what you realize is advanced lighting design is when you make your own decisions rather than going, oh, I saw them do that and it worked for them, so I'll just copy it. That's what you do when you're learning and growing up. Eventually you go, I'm just going to do this because it feels right to me. And I think the last thing is, and this could sound really pretentious, and I don't mean it to, but this whole week I think has been doing a really good job of learning how to be an assistant associate programmer. I think if you go into doing that, you just need to be really clear. This sounds like a terrible school teacher thing, but what your career goals are. Because the danger, is you'll come out of school or whatever going, I want to be a lighting designer. And then you'll go be an assistant because it's a good learning opportunity, which is valid and fair, or it pays the rent, which is valid and fair, or it lets you travel the world, all of which are good things. The danger is increasingly you can just get sucked into just doing that. And at some point you'll go, oh, do you remember that time I thought I was going to be a lighting designer? And here I am. And and the key is usually if you're doing a show and the light designer does something and you're going, oh, or you do it, you're the programming, you do something, and the designer goes, oh no, can we do it like this? And you're like in your head going, oh, I like my way better. That's the time you need to go design your own shows. But I think in some ways what's helpful is, if you start your career on day one, almost put a marker in your calendar on, year 2 or whatever, saying, this is when I need to start paying attention to what I actually said I was going to do in the first place. Or at least make a decision about it, because otherwise, I'm not proud of everything I've ever done in life, but there are times when you go, maybe I should, if I'd paid a bit more attention and turned down some of those programming jobs, I could have been lighting all these other shows. I'm fine with it at the end of the day because I quite enjoy the combination of things I do. There's a story I tell that Neil Austin and I are sort of complete contemporaries, same age, blah, 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 blah. At some point, Neil made the decision. We were there. We had a Christmas lunch when Neil said, I've done assisting, I've done that. From now on, I'm only going to be a lighting designer. Now, from that point to, doing Donmar shows was a really busy 5 years. And from that point to the financial success of Harry Potter was probably 16 years. But it started on the day he made that decision. So if you want to be a light designer, you just have to sort of keep remembering that in your head as you go along, I think.
Wait for it.
Sorry, patronizing teacher.
Oh, that's fantastic advice that I think everyone would appreciate. Thank you for that.
Somebody's saying I'd buy that
you've
book.
already sold a book.
I better go and finish writing it then.
So your show, Tree of Codes, say you can't go and relight it and you needed to employ someone who, none of the people that would ever go and relight it. How would you go about trying to find that person, and what sort of qualities would they need? And say it was one of the people listening at home, like who would you hire to do that job, and how would that conversation start?
I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, the thing is, the general broad version of that is, if I'm lighting designer hat on with a programmer, I would much rather have a programmer who is interested in looking here and may not be, the same 200% level of competence on the desk as somebody who is completely fixated on the buttons and the numbers. Because I think if not knocking them, because I sort of am one sometimes, but if you're a computer nerd, you can get a much better paid job with better holidays and pension and all of that stuff if you go do nerdy computer stuff for a bank. What's interesting about what we do is the stuff that's happening on stage in front of you, and you have to absolutely be interested in that. I did a little show for Mount View just before lockdown. I got a programmer who I'd never met before, and I would use again in a heartbeat, because she instinctively, without really talking about it, A, was looking here, and B, started taking on all the stuff that I was too distracted about or didn't care about, and sort of started filling that sort of, we've been calling it Programmer Associate role, without thinking about it. So it's somebody who I think isn't fixated on what you're doing, because what was great about her was she was very aware of everything that was happening in the room as a whole. If somebody's focusing a light, she knew that she'd need to turn it on. It's that sort of management that's going on that I think is important. So I think somebody who sort of has an awareness of the room and has an eye, knows the stuff, is curious about stuff they don't know about it. But I'd much rather have somebody who'd enjoyed the show rather than the numbers. I think qualifying or quantifying that, of course, is really hard. But somehow you can. This is why I can't have a proper job like Dan Murphin, because Dan has to be able to figure out ways to actually quantify that. I can just sit next to somebody and go, "Oh yeah, you're really good. I like you," or go, "You're not paying attention at all, are you?" So I have a little list of good people.
Well, hopefully this course grows out some more good people. Um,
Doug Green's lurking there. Doug Green has got a little smiley face because he did come and look after the show for us in Paris when it was running there. So he has been co-opted into the Tree of Codes world. And I think the last thing is, I think we just need to be careful with all these job titles now, because like John Delaney, who's been the production electrician for the last 3 Tree of Codes, probably does know that show now as well as anybody else. And even though he's the electrician in the language, I would quite happily send him to go make that show now because it's in his head, and it's just all it is changing the job title a little bit.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, Richard Kilbrace, got everyone's here. Look at all these people.
Yeah, no pressure. Got another question here. Because the role of associate assistant blends in with the programmer in the UK, how do you deal with the upkeep of any show plot changes plus note updates whilst programming?
Typing really fast. I mean, it's like a little note on the laptop back to the desk, and then trying to catch up later. But I think that's what we were saying earlier, is I think if you were doing a show where that was happening all the time, I think you'd want somebody else there to do it. It's all like adapting. I say what we did was we got this role of programmer back into one person. But if you look at the Olympics in London in 2012, where it had 5 programmers, just because the rig was so enormous, it's not to say that splitting that role up again isn't valid if the scale or the timing or the pace of the show demands it. So a lot of it is just about adapting what you're doing to the sort of needs of the moment. But yeah, for me, it's all about filling in the gaps. I've always said if you're a programmer, you should almost never be still. Because even if the light designer is not talking, there will be something you can be fixing or tidying up or making better. On most of these desks now, you can do all of that in blind. So even without interrupting the rehearsal, because it's their priority on stage, you can be in fixing and tidying up. And so I just it's like squeezing another thing into that never-ending thing, until you get to lunch. That's why New York's good, because you finally get to go,
have a nice lunch on 8th Avenue or something.
Yeah. But it's just, it's about never stopping. And sometimes in the middle of that on a busy show, you go, we really should have another person here because I'm the one who's suffering. But it's, I've always, in the early days, like some of the first West End shows I did, I was the programmer / moving light tech. So I'd program all day, and then at lunchtime, I'd be the one up on stage taking the light down to send it away to be fixed. So it's just about filling in the gaps, I think.
What do you make of COVID and the future of theatre at the minute? Not to bring the tone.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm just going to rewind one second, though. Well, the one thing that occurs to me. So the last thing about that question is, so I can't remember, 12 years ago, I made this thing called Focus Track, which is another moving light documentation software thing. And I made it because nobody was doing it, and I felt the need. And I was convinced it would become redundant in 4 years because everything it does should be built into the lighting desk. That's the obvious place for it. So the last part about the question about plot and changes, is if you're focusing a moving light, at the moment the process is you focus the light, you record it into a preset, and probably sometime later in the process you come back with a camera and a laptop and a thing and take a photograph of it. I don't understand why when you say record preset focus, a little camera plugged into the lighting desk doesn't just take a picture of it at the same time. Why when you say record Q1, the little camera doesn't just take a picture and stick it away in your cue sheet in the lighting desk, because then everything would be in the same place. And that would absolutely help with the question you're asking, because all that stuff would be happening as a sort of integrated part of the process. I think that doesn't happen because, ETC sell EOS family consoles, but that means like little ions into hundreds of schools and big EOSs into TV centres where they do a show once and never care again. The niche of shows where you care about it enough to write it all down is actually quite small. And I think they don't feel the need to target that, particularly when there are now, there's me and Andy Davis, the RSC, with this thing called Fast Focus Pro, all doing the same thing. But that would help.
I just think it's all British, though,
COVID,
don't you think? All the moving light software comes out of Britain. Isn't that weird?
Britain, yeah, it's interesting because, again, I don't know who knows the history of this now, but the technological cycles that on Broadway, back in the day when they ran everything on big manual resistance boards, the guys in the board would write down their cues, but all they would write down is the changes from cue to cue, because all they were doing was moving a handle, and it was much easier just to say this cue is this light goes down 20%. And that's actually the origins of what we now call tracking, because when you put a handle at a level, it stays there until the next time somebody comes along and moves it somewhere else, and that's all that tracking is. The problem with that is if you wanted to jump to the Q20, they had to work through the changes cue by cue by cue by cue to arrive at the stage of Q20. So there would be a person sitting next to the light designer, called the tracker, who was writing all of this down into a spreadsheet, but not Excel, like a really big piece of graph paper. And I think you can see some of those in the lighting archive stuff that's on the website. So there's always been this person sort of documenting. And then eventually memory boards came to Broadway, and you didn't need that anymore, because when you press record, it would record everything, but nobody trusted them. So there'd still be a tracker busily writing everything down. So when the computer board failed, you could get all the data back again. And when moving lights came along with the Versafire lights, the desk gave you no information. You know, the artisan basically had no screen. There was nothing saying this light is in position down center. And the programmers were so busy programming that they didn't have time to write any of it down. So there'd be the tracker role was now to sit there doing that as you went along. And a lot of Broadway light designers don't like, or historically didn't like, the way Focus Track worked, because you had to wait till the end to document the show, and they wanted it a sort of running document. I think in Britain we invented the tools to do this because nobody was paying for the programmer to have a friend. You know, we were the light designer's friend, and that's where the chain of friends ended. So we all went out and invented tools to do it. And it's interesting that they've gone back into America, which is, you know, the king of paperwork. But good for us. I mean, again, it surprised me also that John McKernan didn't just add all of that to Lightwrite, because that would have been the obvious thing to do as well. But, you know, who knows why now in the history of things. COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think UV might be the answer.
UV? Yeah.
Ultraviolet light apparently kills COVID stone dead. So I think we're going to end up with a front truss with all of our lights on it, and then like 300 UV lights that they turn on all night to sort of clean out the auditorium.
Bring it on.
Yeah, but I think the play. I don't know if anyone saw the footage of the Palladium concert the other day, which was it was really good to have a gig, but B, just weird looking at all those empty seats. You know, because it should be a communal experience. You know, Rich Pilbrow, I think, is lurking somewhere here, and you know, you hear all these discussions about theatre goers about, this theatre's really cramped and I should have more leg room and blah, but the magic of really good theatres is actually when it's as many people as possible contained in as small a space as possible, because then you get all these connections running around the whole theatre. The New Amsterdam in New York, which is where Mary Poppins was, and where I've lost track of what's there now. Aladdin was there, but they have these box seats on the proscenium, you know, which traditionally are terrible seats because you're right on the pros, looking right across. You can, I mean, it's good if you're a lighting nerd because you can see all the lights in the wings. Disney always makes sure there are people in those seats. You know, they're the rush student seats, but they're always sold because that's what connects all the audience downstairs with all the audience upstairs together to make one big communal audience of people. You know, whereas the opposite effect is if you go into the Littleton in the National, which is the Cross Arch Theatre with two circles, and if you're in the circle, stalls in a circle, people here can't see people here at all. People here can't see people here at all. If you tell a joke on the Littleton stage, these people laugh, and then a fraction of a second later, these people laugh. And what's interesting is you don't have an audience of 900, you have an audience of 400 and then an audience of 500 or whatever it is up here. So you're playing to two different sets of people, and that's odd and hard, but is I think what we're going to end up with if you're sitting next to a person who's 20 feet over there. From our point of view, I have no idea. I don't know how you deal with loading a show in. I don't know how you deal with the fact that nobody else is now allowed to touch my lighting desk because I don't know their history. And just in life, it feels really odd now that every time you arrange to meet up with somebody, it's like this sort of social interrogation of where they've been and what they've been doing and have they coughed recently. I mean, if you hang out with people and somebody coughs, it's like everybody running for the hills suddenly. And That's just so strange. The Thailand show, for various reasons, I ended up programming the show for a bit with a face mask on before COVID happened. And that's really weird because comms stops working because it all, because there's a thing in the way. And it's just all those details that I think we're going to have to start figuring out. But somebody has to tell us when we can do it. But anyway.
Well, Tamika says you're such a great programmer. But when designing your own work, having a programmer with less experience, do you find yourself feeling frustrated at times as you can do the work faster yourself? Do you offer support to build their craft?
Oh, I try my best. Yeah, I mean, the most interesting experience I've had on that regard was when I had the control taken away from me. So we do this thing at Rosebery for college. I do this sort of mock programming course where I go play the role of grumpy lighting designer so we can simulate them learning. And then I traditionally lit the summer musicals for Royal Academy of Music. So whoever's best or wants to do it gets to come and do it for real. And traditionally we used an ion because they had one. And one year we got one of the students who said, I really want to use an MA2. And I was like, oh, really? I mean, and so I wrote him an email, said, okay, here are the 20 reasons that I really dislike the grandma as a lighting designer. And he wrote back saying, well, I think I can deal with this and this and this and this and this and this. And I was like, okay, fine. While you've been replying, I've thought of the next 20 reasons I really don't like the grandma too as a lighting designer. And he came back and said, and eventually I said, you know what? Okay, this is like real world experience. If you want to do it, that's fine. If you can organize it, if you can get it there, if it doesn't cost us anything, if you can promise me that everything will happen, then fine. And that's what we did. And he did it. He's a guy called Tom Young, who now does like all the big rock and roll tours. And Tom was kind of amazing. And I've used the grandma, but not to a really intricate detail. And it just meant I stopped worrying about it. And that was really interesting for me because it meant I could concentrate back on, I could just say, I just want this chase. Go. Yeah, I mean, what I tend to do now, if it's a desk I know, and what you describe is it's like you start by offering hints.
Yeah.
And then you start by, then you move on to being a little bit more prescriptive. And then eventually you start saying, push this button, push this button, push this button. But that's a last resort because I'd much rather you figure it out by yourself because that's more useful to you than me going blah, 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 blah. But you learn quite quickly who's learning as they go and who is just getting stuck. And but the thing I'll say about that is what it all comes down to is the prep. What you can't do with any of these moving light shows or anything now, the LEDs, whatever, is 20 years ago you could show up on day one of the show with nothing in the desk. Soft patch didn't exist. All I like to do was fade up and down. Now you need to, as the programmer person, you need to have done your homework. You need to show up with a thing that will let you control the lights. You need to show up with a thing that if I say make it go 201, that you have a way of achieving that. If I say I want a star gobo, you shouldn't be there going, oh, which encoder pages? You need to have done your homework. Because again, particularly at the very beginning, when you're trying to establish the relationship that you know what you're doing, if the first thing I do is say, make that light go blue, and you're there going, that's not a good start. And prep is, I think Sarah said this yesterday now, is the most important thing. You have to have a show file that that is set up the way that you work. But also in making it, you have to interface with me, the lighting designer, to find out what it is I want or need or is important to me. And it used to be that if you got a lighting plan that had a scroller list on it, that told you what my color palette for the show was going to be. And then you could start making sure you had those colors in the moving lights. Now it's just, a bunch of lusters and they can all do every color. I don't put that on the plan anymore. So how do you know the kind of colors I'm going to be asking for unless you come and ask? So it's starting that dialogue early, I think, is the important thing.
Hey, Jason is asking about the backup lights for Billy. Seem like a great idea. Is this something you try to create for every show? What are the backup?
Billy's very particular because there are so many moments in the show where there's just one light on the one hand, and when it's Billy's amazing because the star of the show is this like 10 or 11-year-old kid who quite often is doing something like a double, triple backflip in midair where you look at it as a grown-up and go, how do you do that? And so it's partly an aesthetic thing, but it's also just partly a real practical danger thing, that if you go to the queue and the one row light's supposed to come on and nothing comes on, this poor kid is now alone in the dark. And you can always go, follow spots, but there's just a moment there. And once you say we need to have a backup in place, then you start to make a choice and say, well, okay, it won't be this angle, but this next light round is still pretty close. So I don't do it on every show. If there's a show or a situation like that where there are moments where there's only one or two lights on, then I'll try and do it. But it's also, it's a judgment. If you're doing a one night busky flash and trash rock and roll show with all the lights just flashing all the time, who cares? Same way you probably wouldn't document that show. But it's, if the show is going to have a life, and then you have time to start to worry about more of that detail. But no, Billy is quite special because of that combination of things.
Well, listen, it's been great to hear all this from you, Rob. It's now lunchtime for us. Guys, coming back at 2 p.m. to hear from Rob Casey about some of our other lighting projects that you've been given. But by all means, stick around. Rob, if you're happy to stay around, of course. And if there's any more questions for Rob, type away. Put them in the comments. But you, Rob.
Well, Rick Fisher's here now as well, I see. So you can just ask him a question. Yeah. Anyway, thanks everyone. It's been fun. I hope you've all learned something.
We have. Thank you very much, Rob. It's been brilliant.
And we'll see you all out in the world whenever we all get allowed out.
I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? But I do think theatre will have missed it so much. Everyone will have missed it. It'll come back.
My test, I'm calling this the Hamilton. I'm a bit obsessed with Hamilton at the moment because it's just the most amazing show. But the moment that goes on sale, everyone will go because they'll be like, oh, I've never been able to get into this before, and now I can. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, is a whole other question. But I think if you're a terrible show or a show nobody's heard of, then you're in a bit more trouble. And I think it's also the test, because of course if you open Hamilton and at whatever capacity and it's half empty from that capacity, then everyone really is too scared to go back, which is the other half of the problem that nobody knows the answer to. But the fact that you keep hearing these stories about like people are gathering in parks for raves shows that people are missing this sense of community and they want to get back to that, and that's what we do. And so we just. My fear is we're not doing enough to be ahead of the game. Like if you look at for example, the Formula One lot, where they figured out in a lot of detail how to get races going again and how to control all the access, or cricket in England is the same this week. We can't do that because the whole point is to have the audience there. But my slight fear is we've had our bluff called now by the government going, you can reopen in August, and we haven't collectively done quite enough problem solving about how we actually do that. So I'm hoping somebody smarter and better than me is all over that. But
it's a bit grim to only be able to sell 30% of the seats in any auditorium. It makes life very tricky.
But it's from what I'm hearing, it's the practical thing on the other side, which is a producer could do that, but their fear is wave 2 comes and they get shut down again. And so you've invested all the money you need to reopen the show, and now you're told to shut again. And what none of them can get at the moment is insurance for a future shutdown. Some of them got it last time, but they won't get it again because the insurers are like, no, we're not insuring you for that. So it's a risk to their own money, and none of them are prepared to take it because at the moment it's costing them less to be closed than it would to open and then have to close again. So one of the things, for example, the government could do would be to say, right, we're the insurer of last resort. Because it might not cost us anything, but we're here to guarantee you. But in whatever scheme they're hatching up, that I haven't heard anything about that being part of it, despite the fact a lot of people have told them that that's a key issue. So we'll see.
See.
Any more questions?
I think everyone's enjoying their lunch. But listen, Rob, thank you so much. I've learned a lot for sure. We'll have to swap more notes on this designer programmer thing. A lot to chat about there.
Just the tool needs to be better.
Right.
I mean, the tool. Richard, we should ask Richard to chime in, but if you talk to designers who used the board at the National back in the day, so 76 to about 1982, they adored it because they felt like they were part of the process rather than dictating a process. And a lot of them who used it then feel that they've never had a tool quite like that since. Now, what you're seeing now is lots like Bruno, when he has his big touch screen in front of him with the color picker thing and the other stuff, is trying to re-engineer something like that. You know, and it's good in a way that the people who make the tools are allowing you to sort of plug other things into it to extend the power of the EOS. But yeah, some of it needs to be sort of in the hub of the desk, I think, to really make the most of it. Do I only use ETC? No, but it's this again. This shouldn't sound terrible, but it's the least annoying of them. I mean, the MA2. I haven't tried the MA3. The MA2 I've done several shows on, and I've been the lighting designer on the receiving end of the MA2. And the danger of the MA2 is that if somebody doesn't know what they're doing, they'll think they've stored a cue. It will turn out they haven't stored the cue. They've only stored some of it. And they won't know that until you come back to that cue tomorrow, at which point it's too late because you've lost the cue. And I know that's happened to other light designers as well. The joy of the EOS is that as an ultimate failsafe, when you press record, everything you're looking at on stage gets recorded and you know it's there and you know it's safe. And since all we're really making is that look on stage, the most important thing in the world is that gets captured into the machine. So I for that reason, I prefer ETC, and also for a lot of things they're doing, like the way they manage color is cleverer than anybody else. The way you can deal with groups within groups to do sort of things moving across the rig is, I think, better than anybody else. And I mean, touch wood, it's been utterly reliable in the 10 years I've been using it now.
Chris,
yeah, it's
Chris is asking, he worked with you in arts ed, and he's asking, well, he said most of your work is on big shows, and he was just wondering how you found lighting in the studio there.
Oh, that was a good show though. I like studio theatres because you can reach the light if you need to. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm venue agnostic. I think what I like is good shows. You know, the Arts Ed show, which is this funny little musical called Crybaby, is a great show. And I like it because you can change your mind more easily. You know, there's this also slight difference in lighting, or a slight opinion in lighting design now, that, you know, there are rules and you design the rig, and once the rig's designed, it's fixed and you can't change it because somehow you're admitting you got something wrong. You know, that's how you build buildings out of concrete. But lighting design, you should be able to go, okay, that light would be better over there. And in a studio theatre, the joy is you or somebody can very quickly get to that light and just move it over there. You know, David Hersey, who I work with forever, is amazing for being fearless about just saying, I'm going to take all these lights and move them over there. Like, we did a show where the upper circle bar was full when we started tech, and it was empty when we ended tech because all the lights had just gone to other places in the theatre. And the bravery to do that, I think, is pretty incredible. Tim's vanished. He's gone to get his lunch. I come here all on my own. But let's just see who else these questions are. People understanding the Broadway rules. Yeah. You need to find a nice American person and buy them a long drink and get them to explain them, because they're a bit crazy. But fundamentally, it's about, there's a very strict demarcation between the doers, so the electricians, and I call them thinkers, even though that's a bit fair, but the designers. And one's not allowed to do the work of the other. And once you understand that you can no longer just run on stage and touch a light, then you're okay. I think that's the key to it. I don't know, you should ask Tim. Tim's just experienced Broadway.
Pee really bad. What I missed?
Somebody, Chloe was saying to anyone else, Rob, Tim, anyone else, any
get a good associate when you are there.
Broadway rules.
And they'll sort you out. Yeah, it is a steep learning curve and how all that, the crew and the schedule works. But if you have a good associate, they'll totally take care of you. That's what happened to me anyway. No.
The thing is, they're not there to ruin your life. They're there to make sure that everyone gets paid properly and you get a proper break. And as soon as it's a really hard switch for a British person to get to that way of thinking, because we're always, can I just work through lunch to get this done? Because that's how we all grew up. As soon as you make the switch to say, if I go and have, I did a talk somewhere once, one of the drama colleges, and somebody at the end said, everything you talk about is about lunch. Why is it so important to you? And you go, because then you end up less grumpy at the end of the day. Same with dinner. Just another friend of mine has a production rule, which is, he says you should always have one meal a day where you use cutlery.
And if you're in tech all the time, every day, all year, it's like that. You live and breathe by lunches and dinner breaks.
Yeah. Yeah. But Broadway is the result. The flip side of the result is that in England, still, if you say to your parents, "I'm going to go work in the theatre," they'll like raise an eyebrow and mock you. On Broadway, it goes slightly too far the other way because it's a bit nepotistic. But there are generations of families working in Broadway theatres where, because it's a respectful, well-paid job, the sons or daughters, mainly sons, whatever you read into that, have carried on into the job. And what that says is it's properly paid, because you can earn a decent living out of it, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We need to stop this British mindset.
It isn't even just the money side of it too. The way that the guys there explained it to me on my first day was, we're protecting you as a lighting designer so that you can do your craft, and you aren't being squeezed by the producer to say, you need to get rid of some of that crew before you finish your focus, right? It's the way of it, it's so they can't cut the flyman, they can't cut the automation guy, so I can't get scenery flown in. Like, all these rules are really there to make sure that if I am doing my focus and I want a piece of scenery flown in, I can have that flown in. And we have so many young producers in the UK, I'm not going to mention any names, but who just really don't really know what they're making. They have no idea how it works, and they're not supporting the people that are trying to build them something. Forgetting money, even forgetting that, like, it's tricky.
Yeah. Then the flip side is, you as the designer need to have done your homework. I'm going to blatantly steal somebody else's story, which is an Andy Bridge story, Andy Lit Phantom. And somebody says, and I think it's in Richard Bilborough's book actually, but somebody says to Andy, what's the difference between working in London and working in New York? And Andy would say, well, in London, I go to the flyman and say, right, that bar needs to be sort of about that height, and it just needs to be hidden behind the border, and it just needs to be sort of just out of view of row 2, and could leave it to the flyman to figure it out. Whereas in New York, he says the answer has to be 29'6", because the flyman will then deliver that dead on 29'6", but he doesn't want to be the one who's doing necessarily the thinking about it. And again, that's a bit of a generalization, but they see the crew see their role as delivering what you want to the absolute best of their ability, and the best of them are amazing. But you have to be very clear on what it is that you're asking them to deliver. And that's part of the reason why America historically has had so much more paperwork, because it's saying, do this. This is what I want you to do.
Sam is asking, if you've been in the industry pre-COVID, will getting a job be easier for you coming back? And then the flip side is, what does that mean for people who weren't doing those jobs in the industry? Is it going to be harder for them to get into the industry?
It's really interesting, because what I keep hearing is two completely contradictory views on this. One is everyone going, it's all a disaster, everything's going to come back really slowly, there will not be enough employment for everybody, all the rates will get beaten down, we should all just clearly go work in Tesco's or wherever. And the other sound is saying, when the go button gets pushed, when the green light goes on, everybody simultaneously is going to be trying to get their shows on as fast as possible so that they can start earning some money again, producer level. And when that happens, there are not going to be enough people to go around to do all the jobs that need to happen on all of those shows. Imagine, like the West End traditionally, maybe on average, there's like one show fitting up every month. Now imagine you're simultaneously sort of trying to remount a show in every West End theatre at the same time. And the same is happening all over the country, all the tours. So there's an argument there to say that suddenly everybody is going to be really in demand. If you know how to turn on a Geo, you'll be somewhere doing something.
And everyone's schedules are going to be messed up.
It's probably
people who are booked to do. So designers will need lots of assistance, I would think, to help them manage a busy schedule. So hopefully.
Yeah, it's all going to clash, and yeah, we're all just going to have to figure out how to deal with it. So there's an argument that if you're in the right place at the right time with the right skills and you know the right people, because a lot of it's terrible to say, is knowing the right people and luck of making the right phone call at the right time. If you happen to talk to Tim on the day that he happens to realize there are 4 productions of 6 happening at the same time, and all 3 of his associates are therefore busy, maybe that's the day that he needs to take a chance on somebody, and maybe that's you. It's horrible to say a lot of it's luck, but a lot of luck is engineered by staying in touch and making contacts.
Yeah, the more you're in the room, the more you can create your own luck, right?
Networking, as I believe it used to be called. Yeah, desk, and lots of people swear by it. It just drives me crazy. And that's just my personal opinion, so don't tell anyone else. It's a bit German. It's a bit logical and a bit, yeah. EOS seems to me to be having, despite what I said earlier about it not really understanding what we're trying to do, EOS has a much better understanding of what we're actually trying to do than Grandma. Grandma is a bit like a sort of light and desk construction kit, where you have to build everything to then do what you want it to do, and that, yeah, just makes me slightly crazy. Crybaby was great. We love a revival of that show. We had a revival. You missed it. What can I tell you? Okay. Any more from anybody else? Who's up next?
Say again?
Was it Anne next?
So we have 2 hours of project time. So Rob's going to field questions and work on them with their projects after lunch. And then Anne McMills is on at 4 p.m. And then we've got like a giant Q&A orgy started by the ALD at 5:30.
Fine.
Cool. So hopefully we'll see you back there.
Okay, then. That'd be good. Yeah, no, we're back. I have to go. A weird history project for the afternoon. So the side effect of COVID that probably none of you have ever thought about, of course, is that if you're a trade magazine that writes about new shows all the time, what do you do when there are no new shows to write about? You could stop publishing the magazine, but then you don't get to any advertising. So we're doing, we're trying to take a look at, like, let's call it classic shows. So I'm in the middle of doing a little history project about the original Cats.
Oh, well, that would be fantastic.
So I have to go talk to David Hersey this afternoon about his memories of Cats.
There's a few extra questions that have just come in. I don't know if you want to add.
Those time,
I'm going to, do you mind if I step away? Can I leave you on?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, go. Jonas, do you think we'll work slow start when we get back to work? Yeah. Oh, well, I don't know. I was thinking about that, actually. It's weird. The thought of having not done basically what I've done every day of my life for 20 years, I haven't done for 4 months. So I think day one will be very odd. In the same way that what I found is that after 3 months, just getting in a car and driving somewhere was really odd, because you got completely unused to having to concentrate. And concentrating is quite important in driving, and it's quite important in programming, but with, it goes a bit less wrong when you don't pay attention. So yeah, I think show one is going to be really interesting. And I think if your job is a real job, which means mine tends to be sitting at desk, being lazy, I think if you're actually having to read lights and things, you're going to discover it's quite hard work, would be my guess. Spot Track, it's a very fine program. It's available on the internet. You should go try it. Spot Track. There are 2 software tools I've made, not for any need to make tools, but because I got bored of the fact they didn't exist. One was Focus Track, which is for documenting movie lights. It's very much like MLA, then later become, where it would take the show file, figure out what had been used where, and then give you a way of photographing them. So that's that one. Spot Track was a way of doing follow spot cue sheets, because I got really bored of watching people try and do it in Excel. Because Excel's fine, but has some limitations. So Spot Track is just a thing designed to do that. So it lets you do things like, rather than typing in the name of the characters all the time, you can define buttons that say, this is Eliza, and this is Freddie, and this is somebody else. Or you can define buttons that say 10, 20, 30%, or bigger, smaller, whatever. So it's a sort of customizable way of making follow spot cue sheets. Because then the last thing was watching people try and deal with, I've got an Excel file with 4 follow spot cue sheets. How do I turn that into 4 individual follow spot cue sheets while missing out all the gaps? So Spot Track was designed to do that as well. And along the way, it sells for money, because a bit of the money goes to the lighting charities. So It used to be called Light Relief in the UK, and it's now called something else that I've forgotten. Backup Tech, and in America to the US ITT one, which is called Behind the Scenes. So yeah, there's a try. You can get a trial and try it. So give it a go. Maybe you hate it, that's fine, and maybe it's quite useful, and that's also fine. My measure of when coronavirus ends is that basically nobody has bought SpotTrack for the last 3 months, and the moment somebody buys it, it'll be like, okay, I guess we're all back to work then. Okay, last call. Any more? I'm going to give you all 1 minute to type anything else, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you all have your lunch. I'm going to type it here too. Okay, it's all on deathly silent. I'm going to leave you. Have a lovely time this afternoon. I will see you 5 o'clock, 5:30, whenever we all meet up again to let everybody argue about all the contradictory opinions you've no doubt heard. And I will talk to you all then.